Preparing to live stream a
Right.
meeting. Setting up your meeting. Done. Redirecting to YouTube.
Well, good morning if you're watching this live. If not, good afternoon, good evening. All right. Well, good morning if you're watching this live, or if you've ever been a fan of The Truman Show. Good evening or good afternoon. And if I don't see you, good night. We are going to be discussing today with none other than Jay Kennedy, fantastic storyteller and game master extraordinaire, about adapting one system to another when you're playing an RPG system, particularly since this is of interest to most people who play Dungeons & Dragons 5e. How do you adapt other systems to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, especially, and with an emphasis of, well, I used to play 3rd edition, I used to play 2nd edition, that sort of thing, and I need to bring that over to D&D 5e because it's really cool, and I don't know how to do that. What's the formula for it? What numbers do I plug in? And we're going to find out that there's different takes on that. As if you've been watching our videos, you'll know that I'm a bit more on the crunchy side. I will tell you all about the game mechanics and the numbers. And there's a different thing, though. Sometimes you need to adapt the tone. And I do think that the awesome Jay Kennedy is better suited for that sort of thing. So before we kick off, I just want to ask Jay, when you are running a game and you say, hey, you know what? I saw this in another system. I want to bring it in. What's your approach to it? How do you start?
It depends on why I think that thing is cool. Like the Hammer of Gallagher, which does extra damage to melons. Thanks to everybody who gets that joke. All that matters is that it does extra damage to melons. I don't even care how much damage. It only matters that it does more damage to melons. Whereas like Sheogorath's like Wabbajack from the Elder Scrolls games turns one thing into another thing in a fairly permanent fashion, depending on what game you're talking. It's essentially true polymorph in a stick. But true polymorph isn't designed in D&D to be random, and the Wabbajack is. So that's a whole nother, like, I want to bring it because it could turn that goblin you're fighting into a super scary undead lich. Whoops, wrong way. Do it again and hope you get a better result. So I
keep whacking at it.
Right. It depends on why I think that thing is cool.
Fair enough. And I do think you bring up something super important. It's why are you adapting this into 5e in this example, instead of just playing that other system? What is it that the reason why you adapt one system into another has much to do on how you're going to adapt it. So one of the things that I've come up with, or that I kind of I take into consideration, is that am I adapting this because my players don't want to change the system?
It's certainly possible.
Because that could be the case. And why don't they want to change system? The most it takes money to go into one system or another. You have to buy the books, or if nothing else, you have to buy the PDFs and otherwise. And if you've already invested sometimes hundreds of dollars in books for 5e, you're probably as a player not willing to invest another $25 into another system book if you're just going to use it for one thing, for one item, for one mechanic. Does that make sense? So that's one reason. Another reason that I've found why people adapt things is because they don't want to bring the metagame of a different system over. So the classic example is White Wolf. White Wolf and its Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire the Requiem. If you want to play that system, you're kind of stuck with the metagame story of the Camarilla and that sort of thing. And maybe you don't want that. Maybe you just want these cool vampires in your D&D campaign. See what I mean?
Yeah. Like if White Wolf has some really badass powers and themes and ideas, like Ifri the werewolf god, like all werewolves are like eco-terrorist good guys, is fascinating. And their powers are really cool. But yeah, kind of locked into the meta narrative. Like you can't all of White Wolf's abilities, the character sheet, the warning at the front of the character section, the powers, all of it say in big red letters, you are a monster, and it makes two assumptions baked right into the mechanics, much like 5e does with advantage. It assumes that advantage, you're going to have it a lot because everything gives it to you. But it doesn't stack, which is a complaint for another video. White Wolf assumes that you are a monster, and that you will eventually run out of humanity score, like that you're only going down, and that it takes place in the modern day. So a lot of the abilities are like I have stealth even under like scanny weapons. Well, in 5e you don't have scanny weapons. Yeah,
Right.
all right, you have true sight and scrying and
There is
stuff.
no X-ray machine.
Exactly right. So that power that looks really cool, some of it doesn't actually apply. So now it's not as cool. Well, do we say, okay, well, I'm immune to true sight? Maybe. I mean, that's close, right? But true sight's an awfully powerful spell. So now you have to like anyway. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, no, you're absolutely correct. And that is one of the reasons why some people don't want to change system. They just want to adapt the one cool thing they saw one day. And lastly, I do believe that sometimes, at least what I've seen, is that you're adapting a different system to 5e or from one system to another because you want to just do a really quick one adventure with that theme without derailing the rest of the campaign. So you want to do a one session horror because it's, Halloween's coming up and you want to do that for your players. Fantastic. But you don't want a whole campaign to be horror. So you don't want to change systems. You don't want to draw new characters. You want these same players, same characters, otherwise to do that one thing this one time, whether it be horror or whether it be murder mystery or any of the other things that other systems are designed to do. And you and I have talked about one, I forget the name that you always say, but where combat really doesn't exist, where it's very much much more of a social interaction thing. It's very much of that high level role play stuff. And maybe you want
Golden Sky Stories doesn't have combat. It only has two of the three pillars that most tabletops are built on: social encounters, exploration, combat. It literally doesn't have this one, which is super weird because that means no matter how you can't do that thing where your players are bored. So you use Chekhov's gun and a dude with a gun marches into the room and you're like, roll initiative to get everybody refocused. You can't do that because it's absolutely
force attack.
Right. No
with
one
cupcakes
ever. Right. Like,
well, here's the thing, and one of the things that kind of comes into adapting is one of the reasons why you're adapting. That's exactly what you have to take into consideration, because if what you're adapting is for tone, for example, you want to be more murder mystery, or you want to be more horror, or you want to be more light and fluffy. Well, the mechanics normally are made to reinforce that in that other system that you're adapting from. So you have to kind of get a little bit of understanding of what that means in that system and what that same word generally, either whether it be damage or hit points or stamina or fortitude, what that means in 5e, and then see how you have to adjust to have the same effect. So that's actually as a segue into one of the questions that we had, sure, which is how do I interpret damage across editions? Now here it was, I believe that they were referring to editions of D&D, but I believe that the same is true. How do I interpret damage across games, across different role-playing games? What does damage even mean? And that, even in 5e, is a contentious subject. What are hit points? What is this thing?
On a kind of imagination sense, for me, hit points are your ability to keep fighting before you run out of gas. I think in 5e, all characters have one hit point. That's it. The last one. That's it. The one right before they hit 0 life. Everything above that is just your ability to dodge and block and sweep and get out of the way and damn it, and keep fighting. Because and the reason I think hit points are this abstract thing, the endurance bar, right? Is that, well, if I have 100 hit points maximum, I'm feeling good. I just had a long rest. I'm good to go. I'm strong. I'm capable. I knows it. My sword is sharp. I have no contusions. I'm ready to kick some butt. I go pick a fight with, I don't know why I'm picking fights with goblins at 100 hit points, because I like goblins and I'm feeling ballsy and I just got a new weapon and I want to shit kick some goblins. Well, after a series of natural ones, coupled with some natural 20s on the other side, and they also just got new magic weapons, I have 4 hit points. I'm just as effective as I was at 100, completely. I don't have diminishing return. If you have 100 hit points and somebody beats your ass until you have 4, You're probably bruised. Maybe you've got a broken bone. You might be missing some teeth. D&D doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have diminishing returns as your hit point bar shrinks until you hit
Correct. It doesn't.
0, and then you fall over. So, and then as soon as you get even one hit point, boom, you're back to normal. So I think that D&D characters have exactly 1 hit point, and then all of this is just extra Iron Man. Like,
Fair enough. Fair enough. I've heard hit points defined as everything from, I believe, if any one of you guys are fans of Matt Colville, he defines them as they're a measure of your heroism, which is how much you can do heroic stuff before you die.
right.
I've always kind of interpreted them a little bit like the stamina bar instead of the health bar for characters, because as you said, you're running low on gas. That's the thing. So they can really represent whatever you want them to represent in game, whereas mechanically what they represent is how many hits you can take before you fall over. And that's it. It's not how many hits you can take before you get tired. It's not how many hits you can take before you fall over and can do nothing more. So that kind of interpretation of them will also help you adapt one system to the other. Does the other system use hit points, or does it use magic points that once you deplete them, you can no longer do magic, but you can still fight, or that sort of thing? So you can tie those in together. And one of the mechanics that used to be very interesting in 3rd edition, for example, is that some things, some spells, some craftings had an XP cost.
Oh, yeah.
If you wanted to create a magic wand, you not only had to have the materials and the money and otherwise, and the feats to do it, which is a whole different can of worms, you also had to have enough XP to spend and not go down a level.
Right.
Well, one of the things that I have seen, for example, is that some people will adapt that as, well, it's going to cost you hit points. Instead of costing you XP, you're not going to lose levels or otherwise, but if you're going to do it mid-battle, it's going to drain you. And that is a mechanic that is very much adapted from the non-Vancian magic systems. So anything that uses points or otherwise, they'll say, well, what is your pool of points? Well, D&D doesn't really have a pool of points unless you count sorcery points or key points. That's very class specific. You could,
but it's very narrow.
It's very class specific. But what you always have a pool of points of is your hit points. And since you don't have to interpret hit points as blood in your veins, you can interpret hit points as how much you exhaust yourself. You can always use your hit points as a pool of resources for when you're adapting from a different system, something that needs a pool of resources, because you're never going to kill yourself doing it, but you can do it only limited times that, you might, that's all you can do in a day. You don't have that much energy in a day. That's just your hit point pool. So how do I interpret damage is very much tied to how do you interpret hit points and what you can use them for. And never be afraid of using these resources. If any one of you guys is a player of Magic the Gathering, which I know Jay Kennedy is at least slightly aware of, if not an avid player, think of it like when you're playing with the color black. You can sacrifice hit points, you can sacrifice creatures, everything can be turned into a resource as long as it has a measure. And hit points are a measurable amount of something. Right. So a resource it is.
Just like in D&D, if you're playing the black deck in Magic, winning with 1 hit point is winning. Like, if you walk away from the table the victor, it does not matter how many hit points your deck happened to have left over when you walked away.
Whereas you can also lose if you don't have anything in your deck. Using that, there's totally more than one way to lose a fight.
Right. You can have 300 hit points because you're my friend Dan, and he does white decks and buff. Like every time I play an angel, I'm gonna get 10 more hit points or whatever. And then he'll build his deck so that he can kill off and respawn the same angels, tripping that card over and over and over again. But if I destroy that thing, he'll have no choice but to eventually play the angels and mill his own deck. Right. So you can lose by being unable to draw, but have 1,000 hit points. I'm just kidding. I'm never going to do that. I'm going to burn him away with lava and fire. Never. Pure burn. Just funny.
Completely off subject. My particular favorite method of winning in MTG is milling ever since,
of course,
4th edition. So it's always been something, because it's just so satisfying when you have no way to punch them, but they're just down. They're like, all right, your turn. But either way, that is completely a different matter. Completely different. So just like when you're adapting, when you're interpreting damage and interpreting HP. Another question we had is, how do I modify skills across edition? And it kind of comes down to similar situation of what you interpret of them. But I do believe that skills are defined not by the word that titles them, but by what situation they're used in.
Agreed.
So the classic example, and I think that most people who are watching are probably adapting 3rd edition or 3.5 to 5th edition, simply because there was a lot more 3rd edition players than anything else. And the example that I always use is the Fortitude save. So the Fortitude save is used in 3rd edition when you have to withstand being poisoned, or when you have to withstand being otherwise depleted in your constitution, which is exactly what it's called in 5th edition. So if you're adapting a module that has a drinking game, and you have to win this thing or you're going to be poisoned, and then from there the battle's going to start. Well, what save do you use? You use the Fortitude save in 3rd edition. Well, there is the exact equivalent, which is the Constitution saving throw in 5th edition. So I would always advise, worry less about the name of the skill. Look at the scenario you're adapting, the adventure you're adapting. Like, okay, it's a drinking game. Well, in 5th edition, what do we use for drinking games? Constitution. Oh, it's a physical contest of agility. What do we use in 5th edition? The dex save. So It's not a matter of the name, it's a matter of the function.
Right. Unless, we actually already do this a little bit. For those of you who play 5e raw, I promise I don't cast all that much shade on you. Maybe a little bit. Anyway, I'm just kidding. But you play the game you love. As Franco goes, you mean this guy. Anyway, in 5e, we already have that a little bit. The intent behind the roll. We already have that with finesse. Think about it. A dagger lets you use strength or dex. In theory, your player will choose the one that is the one that's mechanically higher on their character sheet. A +4 dex is better than a +2 strength mechanically. Since D&D is a fighting simulator, a lot of the time, anything you can be better at in attack mode, you'll probably try and shoehorn into your advantage often. This isn't min-maxing. This means two things. You are adhering to the better math. Good for you. No one wants to lose. And two, this in theory means your character is better at that thing in an in-world sense. Conan's strength score is off the chart. That doesn't mean, so when Conan's player uses strength for everything that he can possibly use it for, he's not min-maxing. He's literally playing to the character's strengths. Literally. Because Conan's stupid strong. So 5e already has that in finesse. If you extrapolate that into the entire system, the intent behind every roll. Like I'll ask, Franco's in one of the tables for now. He's in one of the tables that I'm hosting. And a lot of the time he'll hear me ask the group, like, okay, they'll be like, what kind of skill check can I make for this? I don't know. How are you trying to do it? And I think like 3rd edition with your fortitude pitch, excuse me, I'm not awake yet. There's also for checks, because the difference between a check and a save is not very big. There's the search.
Well,
okay, all right. Argument for another time. For me, the word save and check save and like to hit roll, they're all the same thing. You're rolling die to get a specific effect. But the 3rd edition had two different skills that these days we kind of compress. They had spot and search. Not only were those two different skills, they were controlled by two different stats.
Yeah.
And that tends to annoy people when they go into 5e. If you have 3rd edition, you're used to the granularity. If you have 5th edition, you're like, what do you mean you want to subdivide the skill? Anyway.
Absolutely agreed there. Now, here's the thing about subdividing skills and otherwise. Again, it comes down to what you're using it for. So I don't know if anyone ever took the time to look through the rules in 5th edition. Skills are normally used with a particular characteristic, so whether it be dexterity, strength, wisdom, or otherwise, but they don't have to be. So there is a case to be like, if I'm intimidating, this is the example I use in the book. if I'm intimidating a hostage by speaking to it in a creepy manner and making threats, then it's a charisma intimidation roll. So I'm going to use my charisma modifier, and then I'm going to use, if I have proficiency in intimidation, then I'm going to add my proficiency there. But maybe who's intimidating is not a smooth talking, silver-tongued, threatening mastermind. Maybe it's the barbarian who is holding him with one hand and has his club in the other hand, and you will tell me this thing. You are not intimidating him with your charisma. You're intimidating with your strength. So you're going to use your strength modifier.
You're going to get out of my way or I'm going to pound you. Right.
Right. Well, actually, 5th edition allows for that. It's actually in the rules that you can use a different stat for the skill than the one usually used. So when you have that sort of granularity that you want to translate into 5th edition, if you have a character or an NPC in this case that only responds to violence, then what you're going to do is you're going to say, well, if you want to intimidate this character, you use your charisma for it, and otherwise you're going to tell your player, like, he seems not to respond, and he is cocky as ever, and he simply is about to spit in your face, and otherwise. But every now and then he glances over at the barbarian with a little bit of a wary look, kind of cueing them in that you need a different skill for this. See what I mean? So again, that's how you identify the skill use across systems. In Call of Cthulhu, for example, investigation is a big deal. Big deal. Maybe you want to run a investigation one shot in 5th edition for your players. So maybe they're not super intelligent. Maybe that's their dump stat for all of them, because that could happen. So but here's the thing, you can investigate with more than your intelligence. You can investigate with your street smarts. You could be Mata-Hari and you investigate with seduction, and that's how you get the Nazi officials to reveal their information for you. Actually, I think it was the other way around, but either way. I know what you mean. I'm not a Mata-Hari expert.
I'm a fan of the Cyberpunk system as a whole. The new Cyberpunk Red one's pretty great. I had real doubts it's good. Cyberpunk has a massive, holy crap, major focus on awareness as a skill.
I did not know.
So skill is a D10 system. Skills go from 1 to 10. And you have your stat, just like in D&D, you have your stat and your skill. Awareness comes off of your intelligence, I think. Either that or your will. A lot of the time I'll tell my players to make a will save and they blink at me and I'm sorry, I meant wisdom. Because it's the same crap. They're just calling it something else in a different system. I do find heroism, Matt Colville's definition of heroism for your hit points, to be interesting, in that I own multiple systems where heroism is an actual stat separate from the rest of your stuff, which does go up and down and has a lot to do with a version of stamina, which is, I think that's really fascinating. The Capharnium system I just picked up, for example, has heroism as an actual stat written on the character sheet that goes up and down consistently. And when it's low, so are you. And when it's high, you can take a whole bunch of punishment that you can't normally take. It's like a stamina bar powered by your inner hua. It's really something. Your inner hua, right? That's.
I just want to.
You were saying?
I want to mention something that I believe that a lot of 5th edition, both players and DMs, get wrong, because I've seen it on forums and I've seen it discussed in many of the groups.
Yeah.
Is the difference between wisdom and charisma in 5th edition. So here's where it gets a little bit where my translator abilities come into play. So for those of you who don't know, I am a professional translator, which means I take things from one language and put them in another, which I've always said the more languages you speak, the easier it is to understand many things, simply because you can say them in a different language and it has different context. Well, one of those is charisma, which comes from charis, which is a French word. And charisma in 5th edition is much more akin to how the word is used in French than how it's used in English. So in French, charisma, or your charis, has more to do with your ability to impose your will on the world. As in, I want this to happen. And when I walk into the room,
it happens.
Either because I have great authority or because I'm very suave. It doesn't matter why, but I have such charisma that the world accommodates to it.
Right.
So, for example, So when that's the difference between in fifth edition between wisdom and will. So if you have a will save, it's how much you can impose yourself on the world. In fifth edition, that's a charisma save. It's not a wisdom save, which is a funny thing. That's more. Right. That's why intimidation is a charisma thing. That's why sorcerers and warlocks use charisma as their spellcasting ability, because it's their inherent power to impose themselves on the world, and that's what fuels their magic. Whereas a wizard has to think it through and it's like, okay, I pull on this part of the weave, this part of the weave is more formulaic. They have to know what they're doing. Whereas when you're a charisma-based spellcaster like a paladin or a sorcerer, it's how much, in the case of paladin, how much authority you have to impose your will on the world. In case of a sorcerer, is how much can you persuade the world to be what you want it to be. In the case of a warlock, how much can you bully it into being what it is.
If you had a situation where you were, I don't know, a cleric, right? And you know, not because of your charisma or even your wisdom, you're not sizing somebody up. You know that this guy you need information out of is a devout follower of your faith because he comes to your services whatever your holy day is, right? He has a great attendance record on whatever your holy layout is. Maybe it's Mondays for 20 minutes once a week. Maybe it's every Sunday in the morning. Got to get good seats for hours. Who knows? Whatever your holy blueprint is, he's got 100% accurate, attendance record, and he's a devout follower. That wasn't you like sniffing him out. That wasn't you sussing him up. That wasn't a cold read. You've known him for years, and now you need information. And because you've known him for years, that you can probably get this information out of anybody in the group, but you're going to squeeze him because he's a weak little spineless thing. And he hopes that one day his faith will make him strong. So far, it's not working, and you know it. So you march up to him with the book, right? And you scripture the crap out of him and make him feel even weaker until he cracks and tells you what you need to know. Well, scripture that you have written and read 1,000 times, that's not wisdom. That's rote retention. That's public school. That's intelligence. So I would be all for you making an intelligence-based intimidation check. Absolutely.
For sure.
For sure. Squeeze that dude. Because none of that. Go ahead.
No, you touched on something that's super important as to how do I modify skills across editions. And the truth of the matter is, you don't modify the skill. You notice what it's being used for.
Right.
And that is the skill that you ask to be rolled in 5th edition, the one that's equivalent to that use. And that's one of the great allowances of 5th edition, that it's not a hard rule that intimidation has to be charisma. Perception has to be wisdom. No, it could absolutely be something else if you're using it in that manner. And if a different system treats it differently, well, for this occasion, on this challenge, you're going to use this skill, this statistic with the skill instead of the other statistic with the skill.
So my favorite 5e adjacent system that I've played with, that I happen to own, is Index Card RPG, which is Hankering for Nail over Runehammer. If you see this, hey, love your stuff. I interviewed him once. He's a really nice guy, manic as hell in the best way.
I hear he is. I don't know him, but I hear he is.
He bought 5th edition. Went, okay, I like this. I love that. That's all right, I guess. I don't really love this. Rip, change, and he has himself a new system, basically, and stuff. But it's still 5e. It's still very much 5e. You've got advantage, disadvantage, 6 stats, classes that match. It's 5e. It's just simplified 5e. So the character sheet has your 6 stats on it. He makes sure that every dice gets a function, which is cool. But anyway, it has 6 stats on it. It has armor class, all that stuff, which you won't find are any skills on the character sheet. 0. None.
Okay.
There's also no skill modifiers. Rather, there's no base stat. So if you have a strength, traditionally 5e, what's the mechanical difference between 10 and 11 strength? Nothing. There's, barring the occasional...
It's a 5% chance.
Well, yeah, on a die roll, there's a 5% chance. Right. If I'm going to drag something, I think there's a weight differential between 10 and 11. But for the purposes of skill checks, there's no difference. It's a +0 modifier. And 9 times out of 10, that's what your players will be using their stats for. When those stats don't get them anything else like additional spells, Your strength and dex and con saves are almost entirely either for extra hit points or their mechanical or their modifier. Strength doesn't get you extra hit points. It's pretty much exclusively used for picking things up, carrying things, and even that could turn into a con save pretty fast. Or
I can see that, yeah.
or getting your extra damage on the die. So Hank said that's annoying. Players don't care. The average player doesn't care between 10 and 11. They care what their modifier is. So that's all you get. So if you have +1, if you have strength of 1 in ICRPG, that means you have a strength of 12. We're just skipping over that.
Sure.
Step. You have a +1 to your strength dice. That's it. So, and then you pick a class. I'm a barbarian, say. So we just kind of assume that when I do strength stuff, I'm better at it than the guy who's not good at strength-based stuff. Maybe Hank moves the DC down for me, going from, as a general rule, ICRPG locks in at 12 for armor difficulty class all the time. Okay. Always. Everything you're going to do in this room is DC 12. Maybe everything you're going to do in the next room is DC 12.
Oh, yeah, I heard about this. Yes, I've seen that.
Is it less variable? Is it less dynamic? Yes. But the speed of understanding and play I traded for it, I cannot recommend it enough. And that doesn't mean you can't go up and down. It just means that you have a resting DC. You do in 5e too, though. Once your players have when they're at a certain threshold, you kind of know what the some of them are going to pass and some of them aren't DC is. Hank just did the work for you up ahead of time, so you don't need to play a bunch to figure that out. So maybe we move the DC down on the strength-based check. We say for the barbarian, the DC, because he's going to catch something really heavy, like a giant threw a boulder at him. But there are 4 giant, and they've each thrown a boulder at each of the party members. Your sorcerer's DC is 15, because he's kind of tiny. The barbarian's DC is like 10 or less. Now, if he
can still fail, but
right, if somebody watching this says, "Hey, that's not fair," because you changed the DC per player in the moment, consider what mechanical bonuses do. The barbarian's math goes up, the sorcerer's doesn't. It is the same thing, just interpreted from the other side. I did it instead of your dice. In ICRPG, I did it, and your dice helped you be better at it, closing that gap, making that gap even more distinct. The chance of the barbarian succeeding is higher than it would be in 5e, and the chance of the sorcerer failing hasn't really gotten any worse. Just the people that will succeed more often. And I think most skills, if we just assume that your class is good at the things we all kind of in our mind's eye think your class is good at, you don't even need skills. I'm kind of hoping in 6th edition they're not even on the sheet.
Well, and that's a thing that a lot of misinterpretation has gone over, because 5e actually explicitly says that you don't have to roll for everything. You only have to roll when there's a chance of failure.
Right.
If there's no chance of failure, don't roll. Hey, the barbarian is going to break down this door. There's no chance of failure. He breaks down.
I would extrapolate that out to. I would redefine that as only roll when failure would matter. If the barbarian, if the rogue is darting across a bridge at night, he's got a bag of loot, right? It's well tied, right? He could fall off the bridge and hit the moat and swim back out. We all know he can swim, right? With the loot, it doesn't really matter. If he falls out, the worst that's going to happen is he's going to get wet. He can still fail off the bridge. It's raining, it's wet. I don't care. It doesn't matter, because he has essentially enough time to do over. If he's running across the bridge and it's raining and he's being shot at by guards, and if he falls or loses his footing or something, now he's going to get perforated. All right, now you roll.
Now it matters.
Now it matters.
Yeah, right. Otherwise it's just a narrative situation. And that is one of those things that when you're adapting one thing to another, you have to take into consideration. Tone. Agreed. And that's a very difficult thing to adapt, because tone has to have a mechanical backup. You can't have horror if there's no way to fail.
Right.
You can't have mystery if there's no way for the perpetrator to get away from you. If you cannot fail in catching them, if you cannot fail in finding out the investigation, there's no way to fail. But how much is too much. So one of the things that is advantageous about 5th edition is that, and I know you've heard of this term before, bounded accuracy limits where you stand on the probability of those rolls. So you really have to determine is how hard is it to fail and how swingy should it be? And what do I mean by swingy? If I succeed, is it a big success? And if I fail, is it a big failure? Or if I succeed, it's just an incremental advantage, incremental, little success bit by bit, and same way with failure. I believe, and this is just my interpretation, that if you want more drama, if you want people at the edge of their seats, because it's a dramatic situation, it has to be swingy. It's either an all or nothing moment. Whereas if you want investment, if you want them to engage and you want them to continue and piece it out, it has to be very not swingy. It has to be very incremental. So is it the big dramatic climax? Is it the all or nothing? If I don't make this sword strike, the world comes to an end. That's very swingy.
Oh yeah.
Whereas, okay, we're gonna mull down that bad guy, and we have a clock on on it, but we have enough time that we can do this over and over, and we have to eventually get it. That's non-dramatic. That's very tactical and engaging. You have people there. Well, the tone kind of sets you up for that. Horror, super swingy. If it's not going to be a dramatic failure, then it doesn't really scare you. So the mechanics of it have to reflect that. So it's the classic fail, save or die situation that we used to have in other editions of D&D. Well, why was that effective? Because it's very dramatic. Because everyone at the table is waiting to see that die drop or whatever mechanic you're using to see if we're going to do a big cheer or we're going to start rolling up new stats for new characters.
Before anybody starts reintroducing, if you got rid of them, save or die moments into your games, I insist that you talk to your players about that first, because that will not guarantee psychological buy-in. What you might get is players looking at you like, you son of a, and then like not wanting to play with you anymore. That's a dangerous thing to introduce without at least some in-game warning, if not a straight-up conversation. Be like, hey, look, this, and I've been able to pop out of game and say, hey, look, in case I don't want anybody to feel gotcha'd or anything, this next dungeon is terrifying. If you go in there, you could very well die, right? Like, I'm gonna just be upfront about it. Like, the traps in there are enough. I know how many hit points you have. They're enough. Are you sure? And then you right back into game. It's worth it to pop out sometimes. Save or die.
Which is absolutely fine to do.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. Even if in sessions, and this is a very important thing, I do believe that even if in session 0 you cleared up and people agreed that their characters could die, it is important to know they can always die, but right now they really might die.
Right. Your traditional odds of death have gone up a lot, and I feel like you should know, right?
Correct. Because and here's the thing, I actually had a player die in my last session 2 weeks ago on Monday, and this is a player who is very not necessarily introverted, but is very quiet. And he is in there for the story. He doesn't really speak up that much, but he's having a good time. So he's in there for the story. He does his thing, but he died.
Okay.
And so I paused the game for a moment and I said, okay, you're all a 6th level party. The person that died was the cleric who could have revivified the other people. So you guys have no option in mechanics.
Right.
And I asked the player, do you want to continue playing with this character, in which case we'll open the options of how the rest of the party could bring you back to life? Or do you want to say this was a heroic end for this character? Because he died saving other characters, which I thought was super dramatic.
That is pretty cool. Yeah.
Cool. And kind of memorialize that, and he was like, I kind of like this character, and everyone else at the table said, yeah, we want to keep him. So like, okay, all right, then we definitely went there, and it derailed a little bit the plot that we were going on. But they had to go to a temple and the whole thing and pay for the service of revivifying, which, by the way, handy dandy. That is another thing that you should always know about 5th edition. And I always have my practical tools. Temple services. What do they cost? How much does it cost to bring someone back to life, and the availability of temples? Which, Jay, you'll know that I'm a big fan of having these at hand.
Your math bits.
Yes,
right.
It definitely is. Yep, a little math. So even though we had already agreed, session 0, that characters could die and you just need to roll up a new character, I still went out, like we agreed previously, but do you want to keep this character? We can still find a way to have that happen. And that's a thing that's tonal. So other systems, Call of Cthulhu, assumes that that's never on the table.
Right.
That if you die,
you're
you
dead.
die, because otherwise it isn't horror.
Right. If
you want to have,
go ahead.
That's the thing. If you want to adapt from another system the tone, that has nothing to do with the mechanics. It has to do with the consequences of failure.
Right. If death is a temporary setback, no matter how temporary it is, if death is something you can undo in 5 minutes, a weekend, a year, even. I mean, think about all the loved ones you don't have anymore. If you could just pause your life for a year, I mean, then you could just have them back like it never happened. I mean, I know lots of people that would do that. They would take time off from work. They would risk losing their job. They would just pause their life to go get their loved ones back. So that you can make an epic quest out of this is one thing, but it still damages the tone. Probably not as much as Revivify, but it still damages it because it takes some of the permanency out of death. Whereas in a horror experience, like I ran a Witcher, traditionally I'm all for, yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah, maybe you get your guy back. Yeah, sure. I'm usually all for player preference. This is a weird one for me. Hold on. Yeah, I'm all for player preference above system and tone. Player preference above everything else. But specific systems and tones kind of you get psychological buy-in from the player, which means that player preference is, in these cases, to adhere to the system's tone. The Witcher, you're dead. That's it. The Witcher, no one comes back from the dead in The Witcher, which is insane because they have absolutely ridiculous magic, but no one comes back from the dead because healing magic, the magic isn't designed to heal. It's all incredibly volatile. If you're trying to heal somebody with magic, you might just blow them up. If we're playing Cyberpunk, there is anyone I know who's played Cyberpunk before has the expectation that I'm attempting to kill them, that they're always outgunned and outnumbered, and if they die, they die. When they get low hit points, if anything, I focus fire. I don't lay off. But then again, that's a conversation we need to have. But once we've had it and we land on that, we land with the pog that side up, I don't flip it over because I don't want their characters to be dead. They're trusting me to be the asshole that Cyberpunk, like to create the oppressing world that Cyberpunk is. If they can find shelter that they can sleep in more than once in a row, and their bad guys go, "Oh, you're down. I'm going to wait for you to stand up." It's not Cyberpunk anymore, is it? It's a much nicer place that happens to have neon paint. So you definitely want to talk to your players.
Right. What you didn't adapt was the tone.
Right. I didn't adapt the tone. Right. Yeah. Which is, if you're a diehard Cyberpunk fan, you want that. That's how come you love it over something like 5e, because it doesn't have that. 5e assumes that the players can get up off the ground pretty much all the time.
Or that if they don't want to, it's because the player didn't want to. Like, you know what? Yeah, the character died. Let me do another character.
Right. It's because they want to change, not because death is going to keep them down. Right.
Yeah, the adventure doesn't stop.
Right.
Like we're still going to beat the bad guy. It might just be a different cast of characters who gets there, but that's the story's still going to happen.
Right.
So that's one of those things that one of the questions we had is, how do I handle less mechanical things like tension and horror across editions? Well, it is one, you have to talk about it with your players, but the tension is literally the gravity of the consequences and how swingy it is. Consequences are unpermanent. There's little tension no matter how much swing you put into the combat.
Right.
Consequences are hard and they're permanent, or they're going to be long lasting. It's going to be something that you have to overcome. That's a lot of tension. That's a lot of things over it. Now, one of the recommendations that I've always made is that know the percentages of your dice, because it is a lot less dramatic to roll a 20-sided die with a 15 difficulty class than it is to roll a 4-sided die unmodified. The percentage of success is going to be similar. But when you only have 4 options, the less options that it looks like it has, the more dramatic it becomes. And that's just how the mind works.
Right.
So if something has a 25% chance of success, just roll a 4-sided die, just dramatically roll, instead of rolling a 20-sided die and having a range, simply because ranges are just mentally less dramatic. Percentage-wise, if you know the math, it works exactly the same. It's a 50, like if you're gonna do a 50-50, bring out a freaking huge coin, you know, and like it's a big heads or tails thing, like you flip it in the air. The percent, like if you roll a D20, you can still split it 50-50, roll 50 less dramatic.
Right. Like
so if you understand the math of your dice, so understanding the math of your dice is going to help you adapt tone, even if the math doesn't have to change.
Almost every question that I got, so I've been asking a lot of people about questions for this upcoming Q&A for, I don't know, a week or two. And a lot of the questions I got were like, how do I adapt damage? How do I adapt the potency of this item? How do I adapt the power of this spell? Whatever. How do I adapt, quote, how do I adapt the magnitude of variable, item, spell, or object, end quote, with percentages? That's it. That solves almost all of those problems. Know how much damage on or magnitude, because maybe it's not damage, maybe it's healing, maybe it's a duration thing, time stop for however many rounds, right? How do I adjust? A lot of those questions are really the same question. How do I adjust the magnitude of this thing for 5e? You figure out what that thing is. Maybe it's damage, maybe it's how long a thing rocks for, maybe it's how much healing you do, whatever. And then you adjust the percentages. If in its system it does 10 points of damage, well, okay, what you probably didn't pull that item out of thin air. It's probably in an adventure or in a book of magic items, or in the hands of an NPC in that book. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Look at the item and where it comes from. Even if it's in just a book of magic items, right? Chances are it has, if you buy a book in 5e that has a book of magic, if you buy a 5e book that has a book of magic items in it, it'll give them an item level, a rarity level, right? You'll have some sort of context as to how much when you should be forking it over, how powerful it is in comparison to other magical doodads. So if 10 damage is a lot in that system, well, how much damage is half of your 15 level fighter's hit points in general? There, it does that much damage. Boom, done. Problem solved. So for me, I don't use CR ever. Somebody asked me recently, how do I use, because older editions of D&D have CR, but they're not 5e CR. How do I do that? Well, and you don't.
CR only came to be in 3rd edition. Anything before that or any other system doesn't have CR. 3rd edition, 3.5, 4, and 5. That's it. So you can't even use it. You can't even use it retroactively beyond that.
Right. So for me, I don't use CR at all. I adjust the math. If you're a group of level 1 play, it actually doesn't matter what level you are. If I want the players to be, every fight has a reason, for starters. Every single combat, there's a reason for that combat. Maybe if I'm being super honest, some of them are to stall for time. But maybe it's to deal damage. Maybe it's to wear them down. Maybe it's to burn charges out of their magic items. Maybe it's to see what they do when faced with this kind of threat. Not because I think the players are going to win or lose. I'm just curious to see what they will do when faced with a bug or a creature that's made out of fire or whatever. I'm creating a baseline of behavior from the players by throwing specific monsters at them to see what they do. What happens when they engage in combat with a monster that deliberately targets one of them? And it's the weak one. Do they gather together? Do they say, no, you got this? I mean, how powerful do they feel? If I have one that attacks their stuff, right? What do they do when that happens? So every fight has a reason. If your fights don't have reasons, don't have them. Or give them a reason. And damage is fine. Yeah. That's a fine reason. But once you know why, Assuming that the fight is specifically for the purposes of causing hit point damage, I find so when the only mechanical notes I have on players on player characters is their hit points and armor class. That's it, and mostly so I don't have to ask repeatedly. The armor classes so I know when I hit you. The hit points is so I don't have to ask, and so I can adjust my math. Right now, actually, the table that Franco is at,
which is gonna get super teary-eyed and dramatic because I have to leave that table. It's terrible. It is
super sad face. The highest hit point table, the highest hit points at that table are 226, and the lowest is 121.
That's me.
So I'm going to take for an extreme threat damage. Something that's going to get everybody's attention right now. A monster does 130 damage. Let's assume that yes, it would. Let's assume that Mistake or one of the people with higher hit points are on the front line. And given that I know at this point how the lot of you behave generally, that'll probably turn out to be true. Olivia, for example, is almost always in the front, and she has 202 hit points. Now, while she took that damage, assuming I hit her and she took the damage, she's going to go, ow! But she's going to live because Zahir's immediately going to dash forward and heal her, or more likely blast that thing into oblivion, whatever. You all heard that number. So now Franco's going, well, crap, right?
Oh, yeah,
because if there's another one of those things,
definitely
I'm going to die.
Yeah, for sure.
This will immediately... Go ahead.
One handy dandy thing that you want to, if you're playing 5e, like most of the people listening here, go to the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 249. And on that page, you'll find a table called Improvising Damage Level.
Yeah.
And this is something that's super, super helpful because it will actually tell you and by the way, I always, I keep that table so handy.
Of course you do.
It's printed on my my little cheat sheet that I always have. Which, by the way, I highly recommend if you're a 5e DM, make yourself one of these. I made this myself.
Make your own DM anyway. Make your own Dungeon Master screen. I absolutely agree.
True, because it's what you're going to use the most. And in my game, I keep track of time. So I actually tell them, well, this is how many hours it is as passing the west. So that way we don't have this, well, I woke up, I fought a monster, long rest time. Nope, that doesn't happen in my games.
Right.
Also, it helps you when you want to plan. This is something I'm kind of proud of. Outside is all the social stuff, social encounter difficulty classes, all that sort of thing, all the practical rules, damage severity by level, how you do all those things. But if you open it up, it is all the combat stuff. It is your initiative order, everything you can do in combat, all of the conditions and what do they mean, time tracker, 1 round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds, 4 rounds, and keeping track of hit points for your enemies. If you have more than 12 distinct enemies in the combat that are not minions, that don't die with 1 hit point, you have too many.
You have too many.
If you can have 25 enemies on the battlefield, fantastic. Only 12 of them, and that's my hard limit, can have more than 1 hit point.
So I actually made my own Dungeon Master. I like yours, but if I had yours, I would put what you can do in combat trackers, that sort of thing. Not the hit point trackers for the enemies, but that first page, I put that on the outside, so your players can see where their initiative is without you having to remind them.
Oh no, the reason I do it this way is because most of the time we're doing things that are not combat, and that's why these are always available. But once we're in combat, none of this is relevant. Only this is relevant. So I just open it, combat times. And the reason it's hard is because I used to play in person. This was before COVID and otherwise.
I didn't realize it was hard. Cool.
Oh yeah, this is foam core.
Yeah, I hear that now. Yeah.
And so I need to walk around and be able to write on this without this bending. So this is just 2 pieces of foam core, by the way, united by tape on the inside to make it flexy, and then reinforced with a little bit of but either way. The point that I was making is that the table that I'm referring to, damage by level and severity, will tell you on the fly, okay, I have this item from another system. Maybe I don't have the time to go through the math because I'm prepping for tonight and I really want to use this thing, or otherwise. Go to page 249 or have the table with you at all times and say, okay, what are my character levels? And on that table, it will give you a range, 1 to 1st level, 5th, 10th level, 11 to 16th level, 17th to 20th level. okay, is this something that will set back the group? Is it impressive but not something that's going to kill them? 1d10 if it's first to fourth level party. 2d10s. Now that could be both healing or damage.
Right.
And
I tend to look at what?
Yeah, or is it dangerous? 2d10s. Is it deadly? 4d10s. That's what makes it swingy. Again, right. So if you don't have the time to do the math, 5e actually gave you the table. Use this to adapt it.
Right.
Is it supposed to be super big and impressive? And your party is this level? This is what super impressive looks like. 4d10.
Right. This is how much damage it does. Right.
That's right. So yeah, definitely you can get granular with it, and I recommend you do, because then you adapt it exactly as you want it. But if you have to do it on the fly, or someone, for example, we have a person at our table here that will come up with things on the fly, and he will just like, oh yeah, now I snap my fingers and this happens. Okay, how much should that be? Well, we're 11th to 16th level. That should be the equivalent of about 18 d10s.
Right. So you might have seen me get up for a second. I went and got so I used to play in person too, obviously in the before times, right? I have one of those big cardboard boxes you're supposed to store comic books in, but I keep my travel stuff in it. I've got, so I'm a big fan of DM screens. One, because sometimes you roll dice behind the screen. Sometimes it's for a thing. Sometimes just to mess with your players' brains. And mostly though, it's notes. Mostly it's because I want to be able to keep track of things mentally that aren't the dice. A lot of the time I'll roll dice in front of the players anyway, even though I have a DM screen, before somebody goes, fudger. You know, that's a whole other thing.
Which, by the way, I do not fudge dice ever. I always roll in front, and that has led to very few TPKs. It's really not as bad as people think.
And has a noticeable effect on tone, because if you roll out front, your players, you can't fudge now, and your players know. Even if you've never talked about it, they can see the number on the die with their own eyes. This will set a different tone than particularly if you were rolling out front and now you're not, right? If that happens in the middle of a fight, they're going to have all kinds of questions.
Now,
so this is my DM screen, because I like having a DM screen for little notes and stuff, but I don't like drawing that physical I don't mentally enjoy having to deal with that physical barrier that I put between them, and myself. Psychologically, that's frustrating. I wrapped a CD jewel case in black duct tape and called it good.
Hey, that's fine. I am very arts and crafty. So for example, I don't use miniatures that I buy. I actually make them out of I paper craft my miniatures, and I make my own terrain with that sort of thing. And so
which is very cool.
It's a hobby I've had since before D&D. I make pop-up cards for my wife. I actually cut the thing, and I actually make them pop up. It's just
that's really cool.
But you don't have to do that. That's absolutely just a different matter. Which is why for me, making my own tools just came very naturally when I.
You definitely don't have to make pop-up cards for Franco's wife. You really don't, in order to have a good time at the table. Actually, if you did, Anna might get the tiniest bit upset, right? She'd be like,
Oh, well, she might expect, like, well, that's what a stranger did. What are you coming up with? That just puts the burden.
Oh yeah. Like, what if the stranger's just better? She'll look at you like,
Yeah, no, good. So one of the questions that did come up, which I thought was just showed how intimidating it is to adapt things. It was, can I modify the system in small chunks? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. If you only want to adapt the one thing, so for example, you only want to adapt the political intrigue part of Vampire, which is something that we discussed the other day, that there's if ever anyone here played Vampire the Requiem, not the Masquerade, there is a supplemental book about the Camarilla in the Roman times. And there is a full I believe it's like 7 pages on how to handle mechanically a debate in front of the Senate, which I thought was fantastic, because it really puts stakes into every part. Your opening statements, how did those go? Is the crowd around you on your side? Does that give you a modifier? Does that make it harder for you? Is your opponent, what verbal technique is he using? Is he a fast talker? Is he a logic deployer? Is he a soliloquier? So that sort of thing. So if you only want to adapt that, you can, absolutely. You don't have to adapt the rest of the system. You can just put that part for sure. Do you just want to adapt the tone? For sure. Take a look at the damage severity table and see what makes it severe or not severe, and how swingy it should be. Is it an all or nothing? You can adapt that part of it.
That might be my favorite question we got.
Yeah, for sure, because it just betrays the fact that people think it's intimidating, or people think it's overwhelming to adapt one thing to another, when nothing could be further from the truth. It really is a matter of what, and again, it comes back to, why are you adapting this instead of playing the other system? Oh, because I just want this mechanic. Then just adapt that.
I just want this mechanic. 5e cost me a fortune, and I don't want to spend another. I either don't want to or can't afford to, which is very reasonable. Spend another fortune. Or what if that system is more complicated? Even if it's simpler, but I put all this effort into learning 5e, I don't want all that effort to go to waste. Right? Mentally, I spent years memorizing the player's handbook. A lot of the time when players, like one of my Facebook groups I'm in, is we have a focus on Dungeons and Dragons over other things. Pretty much in title only. Players are constantly talking about whatever they're talking about. And there's a couple of guys in there that are like, hey, we're second edition players, but here's what we think. They're nice enough to say, because the majority of players in that group, when they say D&D, they mean D&D 5e. And these guys are constantly nice enough to remind us that they're second edition players. And so when they have a mechanical question, we're not all equipped to help them. And for them, the reason they don't want to jump systems isn't that their way is better or that 5e is lame or anything like that. It's like, look, we've read the 5e stuff. We didn't buy it, but we have lots of friends who did. It's kind of hard to miss 5e if you play tabletop in the year 2021, right? It's kind of hard to miss. But it changes how our settings that we love in second edition get represented. Many of them aren't represented. And we are old guys now, and we don't want to have to sit down and create everything from scratch because we have grandkids and we don't have time. And we do have the energy, but we'd rather spend it on our grandkids, right? So we want everything handed to us. We're retired, damn it. We don't do work anymore, okay? Like, so they stick in second edition because it has all the content that they want, and 5e doesn't, and third edition didn't, and fourth edition doesn't. And literally no other system has Dark Sun as a system, as a setting with a bunch of mechanical support. So for them, the idea of jumping systems isn't I don't have the money. They're retired. They invested well. They have the money. It isn't they don't have the brain cells. They do. They just rather invested someplace else. They just don't want to. It doesn't really matter why you don't want to jump systems. You just don't have to. But I think I think every system should have. Here are two of my favorite systems that have a page each on what the mechanical, at a glance, the mechanical differences that separates that system from whatever other system that you own.
That's very cool.
Which I think is very cool, and every system should have a page or two on that.
You know what? I think you're right.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree.
I tend to find that almost every system that is D20 based is pretty much the same as every other system that is D20 based, just broken down slightly less or slightly more granular. Like my argument on that a skill and a save is the same thing. So is it a hit roll. You're rolling a 20-sided die, adding some math, and hoping for a specific thing, which is almost every roll you're ever going to make ever at a table talk. So they're all kind of the same. But anyway.
True. No, you're not wrong. You're absolutely correct in that they're similar enough that you can almost on the fly just introduce the elements because they're not going to be that different. It does bring up one thing that. Oh, I'm sorry. You were saying.
So the things like ICRPG has ICRPG as a plugin, which is what the top of the page says, and it says, "Hey, I play." Brackets, your game here, end bracket. We live in a golden age of RPGs. Despite your enthusiasm for ICRPG, I love the assumed credit. You may already be in the middle of a campaign, or you may play with players that are firmly invested in a certain system. Never fear, the plugin is here. The key innovation in ICRPGs, the key innovations in ICRPG are easily extensible to your favorite system. And then he'll like trade stats for stats, which is we lost the base number because most of the time it doesn't matter. Effort in non-combat, which is essentially assigning hit points to things that didn't traditionally have hit points. 5e actually has this. It's called hardness. How much damage do you have to do to break through that thing? Only instead of just setting the DC up or lower to a certain number, Hank gives that chest hit bar. And so you have to bash this much damage into it in order to get through it without a key. It's the same thing as hit points. He just calls it effort. A single target, like DC 12, done. Well, not done. There's easy and hard, but mostly, right, it's DC 12. Dice types for damage. All of your dice get to do a thing all the time. Because in D&D, how often do you actually roll a D4? Enemies get hearts instead of straight up hit points. So do you. Everybody starts with 10 hit points or a heart. That's it. And you work your way from there because ICRPG thinks that fights take too long in 5e after a certain while. And he's not wrong. Unless you have ridiculous amounts of damage like that epic level spellcaster we have at our table. Unless you have something like that, fights with Tiamat can take 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. That's ridiculous. So you increase the if you want, make everybody's damage, players, enemies, all of it go up, but you keep your hit points at nice double-digit numbers. You leave them there. Everybody, enemies too. So the percentages across the board are the same. Jeff to earn treasure because he's a Link fan. So there's a treasure chest somewhere with loot in it, as opposed to like handing the goblin the magic sword. And for movement, he does far near close, as opposed to like gridded movement. But now you have them broken down to little chunks. So if you want to be like, hey guys, I know we're loving 5e, but none of us like to count squares. What do you say we leave it as is, except we introduce this, we replace squares with this far near close thing. And one of the guys goes, well, I don't know, Jimmy. What do you think, Tommy? I don't know, Tommy. What do you think, Jimmy? Why do you guys make up your mind while I'm still young? Well, you see, we like the idea of far near close, but we're also like, we kind of like to know what those mean. That's okay. ICRPG has you covered, right? Here's what far near close mean with footage. Or, well, I mean, Tommy, I never could use my D4 for anything because I'm a fighter and I'm level 6 and I just kind of, I don't really care. On the one hand, I don't want to roll D4 for damage. That's lame. On the other hand, I bought a set of 7 dice, right? And the D4 just sits there and goes at me. So I want to use it because it's making me sad. Cool. ICRPG will give you a reason for that. But I like the rest of the system as it is. Cool. We're not going to jump. We're just going to change this one thing. And I think not enough people say this part. If you don't like it, change it back.
You can always readapt.
Right. 5 Torches Deep has Roll to Cast. Love it. In 5e, if you cast, I would say Magic Missile, but that's actually a terrible example.
Because you use a 4-sided die?
No, but that's funny. Fireball. You don't roll most spells in 5e. You either miss, you either roll to attack, right? You either hit or miss, that's it. Or they get some sort of save, in which case you don't roll at all. You just do it, and then they react. Now, hold on. The fighter can roll a natural 1 and in theory hurt himself. And as he gains multi-attack, he will gain the capacity to roll natural 1s more than once on his turn.
Okay. I have to, and again, this is something that is a carryover from other editions, which means if you're carrying this over, you're already adapting a different edition to 5e. 5e does not have critical fails.
I know that, but lots of players don't care.
and that is the first thing. You've already adapted from a different system into 5e, so you're already halfway there.
Right. So assuming that you're playing with critical fails and critical successes, just assuming you're playing with critical fails, the fighter can make things. I tend to treat critical fails as it's worse than a failure. A failure means you missed. You broke even in the action economy. You didn't step forward and you didn't slide backwards. You're right where you were before. The goblin had 8 hit points. You swung at him. You missed. He still has 8 hit points. If you roll the critical fail, well, obviously that means it has to be worse than a regular failure. That's what critical means in this case.
Sure.
So you slide backwards. You chip your weapon. You bump into the mage, and I don't know. And he bumped. Like you make things worse. you slide backwards, or somebody else on your team slides backwards in the action economy. It's difficult not to do this sometimes without turning it into a clown like thing. But practice, you'll get better at it. And sometimes a little Monty Hall in the middle of the incredibly tense situation is actually something you want. Anyway, 5. So if assuming you're rolling with critical ones, or whatever system you're using has critical fails, your mage can your fighter can cut off his own fingers. Your mage, if you're playing in 5e, cannot blow off his own hands. This is unacceptable. This doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it depends on the spell. So, and without getting too noodly in it, if you launch a fire bolt, you roll to attack. You can still roll a 1 and have a critical fail. Whereas if you throw a fireball, there's no critical fail possible. It's just how much damage does it do.
And this bothers me because your average fireball does way more damage than a sword. And a sword is a real thing. I live out here in reality land, and I can pick up a sword. I can find one, buy it, have it shipped to my house, and swing it around and learn how to use it. I am never, ever going to be able to hurl fire out of my fingertips. It's not going to happen, which means that thing, magic, is the most fantastic element of D&D, and it is the only one that doesn't exist per se. All of magic and magical creatures are the most fantastic parts of D&D because they're literally the most fantasy part.
True.
How is it
Absolutely
that
true.
safer to use on the regular than swords and bows? That's absurd. So 5 Torches Deep leans hard into that mechanically and says you have to roll to cast. It's just like a fighter does. When he rolls to swing, right, your armor class is DC 10. And the fighter goes, and he rolls an 11. Great, you took damage. The mage does it like this. DC 10 plus the level of the spell you are casting. Level 1 through 9, just like normal, because 5 Torches Deep is designed to wrap around 5e, not replace it. Like a modified system, you wrap around it like an M&M shell. So this means a level 1 spell is DC 11. A level 9 spell is DC 19. Now you still get to add your modifiers like normal, just like the fighter. But if you hit that MAR, we assume with that one roll that you both successfully cast the spell and you hit the guy, which means mages might do better. If it's a level 2 spell, that's a DC 12. If the fighter has to hit that monster and its armor class is 15, like
true, but a level 2 spell does less in the world, which means that it's a safer bet, but your advancement is going to be smaller.
It also gives the mages know what their modifiers are. They don't change very often. So like Sam, a player at one of my tables, plays a druid, and she consistently casts spells that are level 4 and lower all the time. And a lot of her spells that are more powerful than a higher level than that are obviously more powerful than that. And Sam saves those for special occasions when she can role play the situation to being in her more mathematical favor, because it ain't safe and she knows it. So when you roll under, there's a screw up table. When you fail, you lose all of the spells for that level that you were attempting to cast until you get a long rest. Level 1 spell, no more level 1 spells until you get a long rest. You still have your level 2s and so on. And you have cantrips, which in 5 Torches Deep have even better emphasis than they do in 5e, because you don't have to roll, which means you can't screw anything up. And you can use them indefinitely. That's the good stuff, which is how come wizards at I think level 9 pick a spell of 3rd level or lower. It's a cantrip now. Boom, done. Why on earth wouldn't you choose Fireball? Anyway, I had a group.
By the way, Fireball's a 3rd level spell.
I know. Yeah. So I have a group. I think that was Friday nights. We were playing 5e, mostly as written. I pitched the idea of the infinite magic 5, because in 5 Torches Deep, in exchange for this risk, you don't have spell slots. You can cast all day as long as you don't roll under. You never run out. And they thought that was really cool. And then right out of the box, they rolled really bad screw-ups repeatedly. Enough so that it immediately freaked them out. So in that one session, in the same 10 minutes, we slid back into spell slots. I didn't have them reaccount for all of those how those spells they just cast with infinite magics is like subtracted their spell slots. We just pretended they didn't spend any. Yeah, it was a little janky, but it was also a lot of fun. We've talked about it for weeks. And now that's a nightmare they're going to remember for the rest of their lives in a fun kind of way, not in a I got attacked in a dark alley kind of way, right? Like,
Sure.
you don't be afraid to shift your shit around multiple times to find the one you like. That's what we do with video games. What's that? Don't like the build? Cool, I'll roll a new guy. Like,
which is absolutely, and that's another thing that I do believe that the tone of the questions that we got kind of reflected that people thought this is permanent. The moment I make a change, I'm stuck with it forever. If that were true, then you would have been stuck since before you made the change and couldn't have made it. You can adapt as many times as you need until you find the thing that works for you. And this is something that at my tables happens often enough that I don't know a rule by heart. I know, hard to believe, but I don't know every rule. And so I rule it at the moment. And then afterwards I find out, oh, you know what? That was way too advantageous for you guys. But I always say, but we're not retconning anything that was in favor for you. We might retcon something that was disadvantageous for you, that maybe. But if you just came out on top and I ruled it wrong and it was better for you, we're just going to keep it, and then we're just going to change from there. And that's another thing that you can do. Remember, it is about, in the end, enjoying the time you have with the people you're playing.
right.
So it's never going to be, if it's more burdensome than just making it up on the fly, then don't adapt it. Make it up on the fly.
Right.
That's also another thing that you can just do. Now, you did mention something in passing, which I also have on my table here, which is objects and how hard they are and how many hit points they have.
Of course you do.
Because here's the thing, my players, and I custom made this for myself, not because I need, because I think these are the most important tables or rules in the system. It's because they're the ones my players make me look up the most.
Exactly.
So this is so custom made for me and my groups that if I gave you this table, it might not work for you. Which is why, as you say, make your own, because it's going to highly depend on what your groups do.
I have a list of names because my players were always like, and your name is? He's a shop. It doesn't matter. Okay, he's a shopkeeper, but I can't say that, right? Because then I'll look like a butt face. So I'm like, his name is Bjorn.
Well, I gotta say, I'm sorry. I'm the one. I think they put in our table. I think I'm the one that puts you most on the spot for that, because my character is super polite. My character is an Asimar who is turned into a seraph, who is lawful good and super polite and never wants. So he's always introduces himself and he always asks for everyone. So I did not know that you were struggling with that. My apologies.
Oh no, it's good. Anything. So I don't know if all hosts are like this, but for me, anything that pushes me and makes me improve a skill at the table, I'm all for. So please don't.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna have to use the
like this.
That's just what my character. That's what my character would do.
Oh my God, you're terrible. See, and now you've crossed the line. Just kidding. That's what my character would do.
It is. Actually, I really never thought I was throwing you under.
Oh no, it's okay.
There, but now, getting back to this, one of the things that, and it kind of touches on this whole thing, is how do I stat up creatures and beasties from different systems? And the short of the matter is that there's two ways to go about it, which we've discussed. Is you can noodly go into, okay, how hard is this in its own system? How hard is this thing to beat? And that will give you a percentage of success with the players. Well, what does that percentage of success translate into bounded accuracy? That would be your armor class. How many hits does it take to destroy this beastie in its own system? Okay, what's the average output damage of my table? That's how many hit points I need to give it. And that way it has the correct armor class and otherwise. However, if you don't want to go into that math, again, pull up the same 2 pages and it will give you the damage by severity and level. That's how much damage it does, plus also the skill check difficulties, and that's how much the armor class should be. How hard is it to hit? So you can always just either on the fly, if you have these 2 tables, which is why I keep them with me at all times, which is
he actually folds that up like a handkerchief and keeps it in his breast pocket at all times.
So this is the one that I use when I'm actually out, and playing, because this is the one that has something. But when I'm prepping an adventure, I have one always at my computer.
Of course you do.
Because this goes with the books. And so I don't want to get up and get it every time. So I just have a printed out version here. And so I don't have
see, I moved my bookshelf next to my computer. Like I had one built just to fit in that space. Speaking of,
no.
I think one thing, so how hard to beat the monster is a really great start, but I don't think it's the end. I think in order to make your characters feel alive and real, which is not necessarily the same thing as computing them across systems. That question is all about math. This question is all about verisimilitude. But I think that it is, if you're going to have your creatures feel threatening, maybe that's nice. Maybe it's something else. If you're going to have them feel real, I cannot recommend this book enough.
For sure.
Because it will cover things like stat spread. If, like, what does it mean if your creature has a really high strength and really high con? It means something different than if your creature has a really high strength and a really high dex.
Now,
those are different.
So you brought up a fantastic resource, which is The Monsters Know What They Are Doing. Same author came up with this book.
Yes, which I keep meaning to pick up.
Live to Tell the Tale, which is the exact reverse. It is, as a player,
what do I do to kick the most?
Kick the most butt, or to be more effective in my own. And it actually, I love this thing because it actually comes in with some grids and positioning and otherwise, and it is dedicated to 5e. So it is definitely a resource, and I have them both. I use this one less as a player. I use this one more as a DM because I want to put in challenges that they can figure out. So like, okay, well, their positioning should be this. So if they figure this out, this is going to be a cakewalk. If they don't figure it out that their positioning should be this and that's how they should do it, it is going to be a hard time. And that's why I use this book when I'm prepping an encounter. Now, and that's another thing that I think we haven't touched on, but we should, is how much do you have to prep? And if you're already adapting something else, it kind of implicitly implies that you're more like me. You're crunchy. You do a lot of prep work. I will prep for, I don't take time of it, but for a 4-hour session with my players, I will generally prep for 2 hours in my off time, 2 hours a day the whole week. So that's 5 times 2 for 10 hours. And I love it. It is a hobby I enjoy, and it gives me as much pleasure to prep as it does to run. So, which is why one of the reasons why I like DMing, because it gives me another 10 hours of hobby time during the week. But you do not have to. If you want to, you can do it on the fly, and that is okay too. And that's another thing that I think worries a lot of people. It's well, do I have the time to sink into prepping this adaptation of a thing that I thought was really cool? Or can I just wing it and I know the flavor I'm going for. And then at this point, I just get the gut feeling, this is where they need to fail. So I'm gonna amp up the, whatever it is, the damage or the difficulty class. Fantastic. Or do I have to do it? Do I have to predetermine that and set up the battle grid before everything happens? It really is up to your style of enjoyment. So, do you enjoy prepping? Prep for 10 hours. Do you enjoy playing and just feeling the tone? Don't prep at all. Have the tables at hand. Like, okay, now I need to up the difficulty. Very hard. 25. Okay, that's what they have to hit.
So I think we still have the time. Here's a story that I think might be helpful for other people. It was really helpful for me. So once upon a time, a bunch of friends get together to play what we will one day know as Dungeons and Dragons. They are playing a home of they're playing Napoleonics in their basement. I think it's their basement. And they replay actual wars that happened back with one guy in war games. That guy's called the Calculator. Because that's literally his job. He's going to pencil in a big old sheet of paper. He's going, okay, you have this many men. That means each of them does this much damage. So this much damage you do, roll for it. Okay, you have 10 guys left, and they all have this much. That sounds insane. That's the kind of thing I'm going to do with a calculator, not a person called the Calculator. But anyway, sure. Napoleonics were in this particular situation are actual army men, painted for their specific military they belong to, with rank and everything, separated out to do their role-playing actual fights that happened from history. That over time, they decided perhaps we want to, what if we want to go that way or that way instead? And they've got a giant table with butcher paper rolled out on it. And one day, one of the players comes to his one of the other guys and says, "Hey," the calculator, right? The guy who's kind of running it, and he says, "Hey, we have a problem." And he goes, "Okay, guys, sure, what's up?" And they say, "Well, we are all history nerds, right? We've known each other for a long time, right? We all know that this fight would not have gone this way if Napoleon could see the other general down the hill. That fight went that way because the other general pulled a fast one because he essentially got the element of surprise. Here on the table, we can't do that. So it's just kind of harsh on our mellow, man." And he goes, "Okay, cool. What do you want me to do about it?" And they go, "We're not really sure. You're the smart one. You figure it out. See you next week." And they left. And that guy said, "All right, cool. Hmm, hmm, hmm." Next week they come over. The army men they're here, but they're not on the big table in the middle of the room like they usually are. They're on a small table in the side of the room. And there's like an office in that room, right? There's like a much smaller room, and he's not there. And he waves them in and he goes, "Hey guys," right? And they come inside. He goes, "Here's the plan. You're Napoleon, you're Ivan the Terrible, you're Queen Elizabeth, right? You're going to take your monkeys, you're going to put them on the table. Then you're going to come talk to me, right? Person A will come tell me what they're doing. Then I will call in person B and ask them what they're doing. And then person C will come in and tell me what they're doing. And then I'll tell you what happened. The idea is now you don't know what moves the other monkeys made. Fog of war, right?" And they did that. And then about halfway through the session, monkey C comes in to talk with monkey A and B with the host, right? The calculator. And they say, "Well, okay, we were talking. I want to know what do I do now that I'm in this valley?" And he goes, "You're not in that valley. You're up in the mountains." He goes, No. See, we were talking out there. I moved over the mountains. Now I'm in the valley." And he freaked. He had not planned on the players talking amongst themselves while they were in a space where they had nothing else to do except wait for him to do computations that got bigger and bigger over time. Because we're talking whole armies here. He thought it was a grand failure. They loved it. They loved the shit out of it. So he spent a week dealing with that. His fear was basically unfounded. So next week they come over, and the battle map, the D&D's first straight up battle map, is on the table, sectioned off into big chunks. And he's there. And now he says, "All right, you tell me what you're doing, and I'll hold on to that. And you tell me what you're doing," right? And that man was Dave Arneson, the world's first dungeon master. Do not let your fear hold you back. I promise your players care less than you think they do. I promise. Just do it.
For sure. For absolute sure. The only thing that I can add there is that if you make a mistake, walk it back. Dave Arneson is not going to show up at your door and say, no, you did it wrong. And they're not going to revoke your DM license.
Right. Matt Mercer is going to come into your room with a ray gun. Right. Like
nope. So yeah, for sure, just give it a shot. Worst case scenario is just like it happened with your table. They didn't like the change. It turns out that they didn't like 5 torches deep. Yeah, roll it back.
Roll it back. I think spell slots are silly, but if they want to use spell slots, okay, sure.
Now, and again, why are we using spell slots in 5e? Well, because there's a mechanical reason for planning. Sure, you don't like that, you want a different thing because you don't think that planning is required at that point, throw it out. That's absolutely fine. So adaptation is, it turns out that your adaptation didn't work. Bring it back in. Bring back the original. That's absolutely fine. And again,
I have another table where we're doing 5 torches deep for almost a year. And they love it. So yeah, every group's a little different because if every group was, a lot of people have this belief that all the groups are actually the same. If we can just if I can hang out with them a little longer, if I can play with them a little longer, I'll find that they're actually the same as that other group I played with once, or same enough. That's never going to happen. If that were true, then every teenage boy who said, "I want to be in a band," would be in a band, right? That doesn't happen.
Oh no, for absolute sure. The last question that we got was, how do I mitigate change for items that are really cool, but really cool because of specific mechanic not present in the system I want to use that in? The easiest answer is introduce that system into your game, even if it's just for that item, which is something that actually 5e does. So, for example, there are items that require you to roll on a table. The Wand of Wonders is the example that comes to mind.
Mhm.
The caster, the one who's wielding it, has no idea what's going to come up when he says, "Ooh, alakazam."
All right.
There is no other item in 5e that does that. It's a mechanic just for that item. Bring it in. That's absolutely fine. If you think it's cool because the mechanic makes it interesting, wholesale that mechanic right on in. That is not a problem at all. Now, if you don't want to do that because your players,
I think we lost Franco for a second. So I'm going to fill the air.
they don't.
Oh, there you are. Okay, we lost you there.
Sorry, no. Yeah, that's the thing. My computer has a worse Wi-Fi connection than my others. I don't know why. It's just an older computer. But the other thing is that what you can do is, okay, what makes this item really cool? What does 5e do with that sort of situation? And then you can simply adapt it. So for example, one thing is the different fail percentages. So there are certain times that if you fail a saving throw in 5e, you get a bad consequence. But if you fail it by more than 5, you get a worse consequence. So there's gradients. So if your table is already expecting that sort of mechanic, then what you can do is adapt it. Okay, well, with this thing, if they succeed, it's this. But if they succeed by 2 or more, it's this. If they succeed by 5 or more, it's this. So that mechanic already exists. But you don't need to. The truth of the matter is that 5e is flexible enough that you can handle individual things on their own. Overland travel is a great example. When do I put in random encounters? Well, do you want them to be random? Put them in. How many do you want to be? There's this much space. You have a roll this many times, and the average of those rolls is 3 encounters. Fantastic. Right. Do you want exactly this encounter no matter what happens? Then that's just what happens.
Then,
you don't need to roll.
That's what happens.
As you go here, this happened. That's just part of the adventure. So think about the outcome you want. And is the mechanic the cool part? Wholesale the mechanic just right in. Is the outcome the cool part? Make sure the outcome happens. Whether by putting enough rolls that it's gonna happen, which is just a quick math thing to do, or by just saying, oh, this happens.
Right.
That makes sense?
Like I try not to restrict player agency too much. And not just because I get paid to do this. And I have a couple of tables where I don't get paid to do it, and it's the same experience. Players go, I want to do this thing. All right, sure. Do you want to look it over? Traditionally, I say I'm going to look it over because it makes them feel better, that I'm not just ignoring, that I'm putting energy into this thing. But I might look it over. Probably not, because I don't think balance is a real thing. So I'm not worried about it at all. I don't care. If you want to play like a Titan, an actual Titan like Kronos, sure, fine. We'll make it work. Because I think multi-attack is more impressive than Wish. Because Wish you roll once. That's it. Multi-attack you roll multiple times. If it was a chess game and I got to go multiple times, if it was a chess game and I went 3 times, for every time you went once, and we assume that we are of the equivalent skill value, I'm going to crush you, and it will not be fair. If we don't assume we're of the equivalent skill value, that you're a master chess player and I'm not, and I go 3 times and you go once, you might beat me anyway. But if we assume we are equivalent skill, which is to say we assume balance, and one side has more turns than the other, this side will win 9 times out of 10. That's literally what action economy means. And this means that Wish does not set you forward in the action economy like multi-attack does, which is how fighters get multi-attack and they don't really get anything else. And I'm okay with those fighters. But in 5e, fighters get magic too. And I'm like, now hold on.
Well, keep in mind that in 5e, most magic items can also be used by almost anyone.
Right. So, there's that too. Yeah. Traditionally in old school D&D, rogues could do that and magic casters could do that. And that was it. And even then there were like scrolls could only be used by clerics and scrolls could only be used by mages. And rogues were cool because they could kind of do both. But they had to roll for that shit. They couldn't just do it. They were like, okay, I get the gist of this. It's a rod of fire. Oh, cool. Right? Like they built something up. And they'd expend a charge just like the caster did. Right. Anyway, what was I gonna random. So I have a lot of books on my shelf. I've never done that whole shelfie thing where you post a picture of your D&D shelf. I'm not that kind of guy. But on my shelf, I have it's a three shelf bookshelf. It's wider than I can make my arms on this screen, right? It's probably, I don't know, 3 feet wide. 3 shelves. 2 of them are filled with D&D books. The top shelf is filled with classic reading material, Conan, Liber, that sort of thing. But I don't have a single 5e like player's handbook or anything like that on this shelf. And not just from 5e. I don't have a 3rd edition book. I don't have a 2nd edition book. I don't have anything on here that would be remotely counted as a player's handbook, a DMG, or a monster's manual. What I do have, I guess that's not true. I have the ICRPG core book, which is all 3 of those things. But for the most part, what I have is random table books, which I never roll on. What are you, crazy? Like I don't do that. This is one of my favorite books, and it is just like 1,000 magic items. That's it.
We totally handle that differently. So again, I used to play in person, and I loved it. And I think we've discussed this before. I go a little bit overboard, and I do a whole bunch of stuff. And by the way, you showed my character, but I can actually show my character sheet. This is the sheet I use to play at our table.
Yes, his fancy custom character sheet.
Yeah, I made that for myself. It actually has my stats and everything, but it also has the image of my character. But what I do a lot is that I give my players the things that they will be using as handouts because they can use them as a reference. So, for example, there's a player at one of my tables that has this wand that you have to roll on the table. I gave him the table. That table comes in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But I think it's unfair that if it's a game, it's still going to be random, but you have to know what to expect in it. It's still going to be random in your sword, but you know that it's either a hit or a
when
miss
you're
or
on
a
a game show
fail.
and you're going to spin the wheel, you can see the wheel and therefore see what's on it.
Right. Correct. So what I do with my items and this is my binder as my DM binder. I have one magic items right there. Mm-hmm. I actually have the items. I make these, and they are in business card size, so that they can keep them with themselves. And it will have the information of the magic item on it, so that they can hold on to this thing, and they can have all the rules that go with that magic item as well. So I can't have in my games, they never have a magic item that I don't know they're going to have because I made them the handout.
Right.
Now that we're playing online, I still do that. I just put the digital file of the image so that they'll have it, because I believe that in the end, it's a game. And just like chess, you have to know the rules of the game.
Right.
Like there's no hidden information.
Here's one of my, I love this book because I think all magic item books should come this way. It's set up that it's broken down into subsections. You could roll with a couple of rolls, anything in this book, which contain something like 1,000 magic items. So there's a section of tables for item condition, side effects in case something's wrong with it, like the magic item breaks after its first use or whatever, and what chart you roll on. So there's everything in here from weird curios to breastplates to whatever, like the unmoving cuirass, light appearance, a lightweight cuirass of hardened leather. Enchantment: when the command word is spoken, this cuirass freezes and cannot be moved from place in space by any natural force, which means you are the juggernaut.
It's like an immovable rod, but in armor.
History: this armor was created by a young warrior who was slight in body and strength. He would often be shoved away by larger foes, and to combat this, he commissioned this cuirass. His agility combined with his expert timing allowed him to become one of the most fearsome warriors ever. That's it. I'm going to flip through this book, find what sounds cool to what I think, I'm going to read the book, keep my party in mind, and read the book. And eventually, one of those items is going to boom and click into my brain as something. It's going to remind me of a player. at that table, and I'm not going to question why. I'm just going to throw it in the game. That's it.
For
I'm
sure.
going to have faith that they'll find something cool to do with it. And I tend not to use magic items in the book. I was actually having a discussion with my mother yesterday about the bag of holding. I did the math. The bag of holding has been around since at least 1995, because I found it. I think its original introduction is in the Dungeon Master's Guide for second edition, which
I
means
believe that.
the bag of holding is almost as old as I am. And everybody knows. My mother, who does not play D&D, knows what the bag of holding is, even what it does mechanically, which means that pop culture has extracted the magic from the bag of holding. Most people, and in my experience, lots of players, when they say, "Can I get a bag of holding?" what they're really saying is, "Can I not track my arrows anymore?"
Gotcha.
Sure, but you didn't need an item. You didn't excuse not to do that. If it's not fun, don't do it. The bag of holding, much like the vampire and the zombie and the werewolf and Frankenstein's monster, has been ruined by pop culture. It's not magic anymore. So you're going to need to come up, whereas my mother doesn't know what the portable hole is by comparison, which is very similar but not the same as the bag of holding.
I would have assumed that the portable hole is easier because it even shows up in the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Right, you would think. Right, but apparently not. But what I'm saying is, if the first word in magic items isn't items, it's not the utility, it's the magic. So make sure your magic items are magical. If your players go, "Oh, I know what that is. Oh, look, another +1 sword for the pile." Stop it. Give them something else. Cut it out. And if they have enough magic items that they're bored already when they get a new one, lame.
I agree. I give more utility items than weapons, by the way. But for those of you who do not have the random table, the amount of random table books that Jay does, and if you're a 5e player, you can always go to page 142 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a similar table. It's of course less than a book worth, but it will give you a table, who created it and what's its intended use for the magic item, what minor property does it have, what is the detail from its history, what quirk does it have. So if you're just a 5e player and you go and you have or just 5e DM and you have the DMG, at page 142 will give you a similar situation. And again, you don't have to roll on them, read through them, get inspired, and say like, "Oh, it's not random. I want it to have this quirk." Or this wand is quirky this way, or this cloak has it's frail, or it's hungry, or that sort of thing. So don't again, it comes down to why you're adapting. If you're adapting something else because you just don't have the money to go outside of 5e or whatever system you're currently using, most systems will have at least a hint of those other things, enough for you to get inspired. And you can always do the work of creating your own things. But most of that work is done in your own personal downtime. When you're showering, the idea might hit you. You're out on a bike ride, and it might hit you. So that is literally the work, the creative part of the work, and the rest of it is just don't forget it, write it down somewhere so that you can actually pull it out.
For me, somebody asked me yesterday. They were like, "Hey, how much prep do you spend? We know you do this like for a living. How much prep do you spend on, prep time? How much time do you spend?" And I was like, I don't know, 5 minutes for active prep. And he went, and I went, whoa, calm down. Active prep and passive prep are two different things for me. I think they're two different things for everybody. I just bothered to label them. So active prep is when you're sitting down and you got your notes in front of you and you're going, "Okay, what am I doing?" Right? You got your block with your characters and your NPCs and your world notes and your world anvil or your OneNote or your notepad, whether that's physical or digital, wherever you're keeping your shit. You have a thing for that somewhere, probably. Maybe it's my friend Anthony loves index cards. He's got of index cards for his character sheet. When I use notes, I tend to like them on my computer locally over being in a cloud. So while World Anvil is really cool, I can't download it all at once. At least I don't think I can.
Let me show you something.
And I don't love that. But passive prep, I'm doing that all week. I'm watching cartoons on purpose. I love cartoons and video games. Love them both. But I will deliberately shift which ones I am watching and playing because of an upcoming moment. Like I was going to do a table where we starred in like a massive super junkyard place, like a dingy cyberpunk, everything's covered in grime and neon place. I come from a tiny town in the middle of the woods that recently hit 1,000 population. I do not know what it's like to live in the city. I don't know what it's like to be in a place where there's lots of neon. I have never seen a junkyard that was remotely as tall as a building, let alone like a city. But I have video games where those exist, right? And cartoons where those exist. So I'm going to go watch and play those on purpose.
Sure.
And kind of actively watch them, not put them on in the background and then fiddle with my phone. I'm going to actively watch them and just trust that I absorb what I need. That's passive prep, and it does take up a lot of my time, but it's fun. It doesn't feel like work. Active prep for me feels like I'm commanding my brain to be creative, which in my experience never works, ever. So I spend 5 minutes before play going, okay, what do I know the characters' names? Do I do Grant as a player of mine, Zahir is his character's name. I'm refreshing my memory on the last couple of things that Zahir made a big stink about. The last couple of abilities he used a lot, like just remembering Zahir for a couple of seconds. Then I'm moving on to the next one and so on. I'm kind of priming my brain. I'm going to spend 5 minutes just thinking about this group, which in theory will distance my brain from the other groups I host during the week so I don't get confused. That's it, though.
Fair enough. Well, and that's the one. I guess I got to clear this up. We're coming from two very, very different situations as game masters. You do this for a living.
Yeah.
I have never received a cent for doing this. I do this for the pure enjoyment of it, which is it doesn't mean that you don't enjoy what you're doing.
Oh no, I love my job.
We have different incentives. We have absolutely different incentives for it. Whereas
I tend to find. Go ahead.
No, if you heard how I describe my prep and how you describe it, you'd think that I'm the one being paid for this stuff.
So I tend to run into this opinion fairly frequently. People will say, like every now and again on one of the Facebook groups I'm in, a post will come up and they'll be like, well, how do you guys feel about, paid hosting or GMing or whatever word you like? And one of the comments will invariably be, well, if you're getting paid, it's a job. I'd much rather do it for a guy who does it for the fun of it. I am doing it for the fun of it. I just happen to get paid. The assessment, the experience is not any different. I have 2 tables on Thursdays where nobody pays me. They're friends of mine. We've been playing for way before the whole paid thing came up. And I really didn't have the heart to say, so I wasn't going to do that. Not a chance. They know I get paid, and I haven't asked them, and I'm not going to. Call it grandfather effective friendship if you want. Friendship is magic, but I'm not going to do that.
Like if you're a cook at a restaurant, you still can have your barbecue at home and invite your friends over and not charge them for cooking. It's nothing to do one thing with another. You can absolutely use your professional skills in your personal life. There's nothing wrong with
it. Didn't change the goal.
Nor should you.
I'm also free enough emotionally that I need the players to be having fun for me to be having fun. But that is all that I need, which is to say, I don't care. Ultimately, I don't care what system we play. I don't care what class you are. I don't care what tone you want. I don't really care. I imagine I have hard limits. If you want to play a child murdering Nazi, I'm probably not comfortable with that, right? There's a line somewhere, and
everyone has that line.
It's human depravity, not system, right? If you want to play FFG Star Wars, I don't like it, but I'll get over it. If you want to play 5e, I don't like it, but I'll get over it. And it's not going to ruin your fun or mine as long as you're having fun. Did I just wound you? I thought
a little bit.
But I realize that not everybody is in that situation. Not everybody. Some people need more than that. They have a system that they love, that the system inherently brings them joy. I don't have that. So I realize I'm in a unique position regarding most other people.
You are, but that actually kind of answers one of the questions that we got, and we already touched on this a little bit. But it is, can I modify things in small chunks, or how do I introduce players that have never used this? My players know one kind of system. How do I get them to try another one? Because maybe you enjoy another system more, and you, the host, you, the game master. And my answer from you kind of sneak it in. you put one mechanic in that you liked about this other system, and if things like, well, there's no mechanic in this system for that, why don't we try this other one? And when they say like, oh, you like that? Well, that's actually from a different game system. Why don't we try that as well? So one of the reasons you might be adapting a different system to 5e or whatever you're currently running is because you, the host, like that other system better. And it's a soft introduction for changing your group into that other system. And whether it be a paid table or not, it could work. It is possible that that group that originally thought that they just loved Pathfinder, turns out they actually like 5e better, but they just never heard about it. Or maybe they love 5e, but there's something missing when they do a murder mystery. You introduce some Call of Cthulhu mechanics in there, and it turns out that they love them. And so like, oh, well, you introduce them more and more, and they can still say that we're getting together for D&D, but most of the mechanics are now from the other system. And that's fine too. You just have to know why you're adapting the mechanics from one to the other. And personal enjoyment of the GM is definitely a valid reason to adapt another system into the one you're currently playing.
Oh yeah. I think personal enjoyment of the GM and familiarity with the system, if that's something that matters to you, are totally valid reasons. I'm just not subject to them because I don't care. But I totally understand that lots of people are, and they're not wrong to feel that way. If you want to play 5e because that's what you feel comfortable with, bitch, do your group.
Yeah, for sure.
I love mechanic light systems for two major reasons. One, I don't like math. Two, I choose to have faith that the players will lean into their imaginations and come up with skills and stuff like that in their brains by themselves. Because I think the more options upfront you provide somebody, the weaker you are making them, not the stronger you're making them. I think the bigger, the larger the character sheet is, and the more it denotes what you can and cannot do. It says you have here this many skills with this many ranks. What you're saying to the player is, here are the things you are mechanically advantageous at. Here are the things you are not mechanically advantageous at. Here, have some shackles. And I find that unacceptable. But I also think that the empty character sheet, the just 8.5 by 11, that's blank, you might paralyze somebody with the power of choice. So I think in the middle there is better. Not a blank character sheet, but a 1 page, maybe less character sheet. Like I love it. You can fit all the rules and the character sheet on one side of an index card, maybe half of it. That's what I'm talking about. Like that's the good stuff.
I have to disagree, and this is a different approach. But I do believe that I don't remember exactly what the quote is, but it is that limits spawn creativity, something of the sort. And I believe that to be absolutely true. I think that if you give me a set of rules, it sparks in me the idea of how do I bend and break these? How do I use these to my advantage? Whereas if you give me nothing, then I'm just kind of flopping like this, maybe something. And this is not a critique of the table that we're playing at.
As we've discussed over the last couple of months, you leaned into that eventually, and as I understand it, we're having a great time doing so. So I don't know if I've actually said this, but I really appreciate that you went along with that you offered up your psychological buy-in eventually, because in your brain it's ultimately a game, and in my brain it is not. So I wasn't actually confident you would have any fun. Like I really wasn't. My friend Ballas too, in his mind, he wants Pathfinder. He wants lots of mechanical milieu that strings out into eternity. He wants to be able to, after a certain mathematical threshold, he wants to automatically succeed at such and such rolls of such and such difficulty. Period. Like he just doesn't want to roll for them. No, that's a chess game. That's Go, the ancient board game that's older than chess. That's Stratego. That's Age of Empires, right? That's a strategy game. Never mind all that noise. It's a campfire story. It's whose line is it anyway? Except sometimes it's not funny. and sometimes we roll dice. But that's an ideology thing.
And again, that's a.
Go ahead. Sorry. Ow.
And again, that is a little bit of, and believe it or not, that touches into what we're talking about, adapting other systems. Because I mean, I hate to break people's heart about this one, but D&D is intended to be a strategy game. It is intended to be a fight simulator with rules, grids, and otherwise.
Right.
So if you do not like that, and you like a different system in which it's a lot more rules light on that, you can pull in that different system and still call it D&D for the few times that you do have to roll the dice, or do you want to roll the dice, for sure. And there's nothing less D&D about it. There's no, you know, I hate it when people say like, oh, well, this is D&D in name only, because we're really just like, no, it's D&D as long as you think of it as D&D and use the base mechanic of it, and then to identify it, not even to use it. It's just to identify what you're playing. Oh, it's this base mechanic. And then we put all this stuff, which is so well made that if we took out the base mechanic, no one would even notice anymore.
Right.
But we still identify it with the base mechanic. So it's kind of, if you've been watching WandaVision, which I highly recommend, it's the whole Ship of Theseus experiment again. Well, is it still the original Ship of Theseus if I took out all the original pieces? If you want it to be, sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
If system identity is such, for me, it's an absolutely ridiculous argument. I'm absolutely going to make a deliberate stand on that. I think system identity is a ridiculous argument for various reasons, but one of which is that so many, that I'm familiar with just over 420 different systems. And at least half of those, are basically D&D, like basically 3rd edition or basically 5th edition.
For sure.
May make a couple of tweaks. At least half of them, if I had to combine them all and then to directly compare them, which I did once. I had an agent who suggested that I do that for the whole online resume, blah, blah. System identity is so incredibly thin to begin with that to argue that your system is unique is not necessarily a good argument. There are weird Japanese ones like Ryutama mechanically supports gameplay that comes out feeling very much like the travel aspect of a Miyazaki movie, which is fascinating. And because of how it works mechanically is relatively unique. Golden Sky Stories does not have combat in it. And I don't mean because the players choose not to engage in it. I mean, mechanically, it's not supported. That's kind of weird. Cofarnium has skill bonuses to various, bedroom hijinks that you don't see in lots of systems. Like there's some unique stuff, but I would be hard pressed to say that ICRPG and Five Torches Deep are not close enough to 5e that the line is difficult to distinguish, or that the line is so important that I couldn't call them 5e and get away with it.
For sure.
Like now, I love this book. I'm sorry. This has 40 different RPGs in it. 40 different RPGs in it. And each of them is, you ready? Gnome Setters, which is a great name. That other blue page, it's one page. That's it. Move on to the next one. And that's all you need. Maybe less. That's my kind of thing. And those, all of these feel amazing, to play. And some of them feel very D&D-y. Like in Gnome Sitters, each of your little gnomes who's off to find their promised land, their place to live, right? You're leading the idea is that the entire gnome race is behind you. And each of you gets a gnome with a specific class. And from there you move on and you find the perfect lawn to move into. What makes a perfect lawn? Does it have a fire extinguisher? Is there the Lee of the Stone, like the Secret of Nim? How many dogs live nearby? Do they get chained up regularly? If they live inside and they don't get out, probably not a big deal. If the lawn is filled with dogs on chains who snap that shit all the time, maybe you don't want that one, right? It covers everything. Right, or maybe eaten. I mean,
shoot, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So before we close out, because we actually ran a lot longer than I thought we would.
We do.
Last thing, this was not something that we got a question about, but it is something that I think it should be touched on, because it is exactly the type of thing that's happening when you're adapting something. Is what about all those mini games that now are so popular in D&D? And again, I'm going to bring out my trusty stuff. And I actually embrace those things because they are fun for my players that have nothing to do with the normal grind of D&D. But you can have your tavern drinking mini game. By the way, all of these, I did not make them. You can get this at what's the site? DM, the DM portal thing. I'll link it up there. But these little games are literally mechanics that don't exist in D&D, made to handle a specific situation. A drinking game. Okay. An archery contest. There's a mini game for that. This is one of my favorites. You're at the bar, arm wrestling. How do you handle? They are little games which are nothing more than small mechanics from some other system that does have arm wrestling in it,
right?
Natively. Well, how would we handle that in D&D? Well, this is the adaptation for it. Little, magical clock game for wizards and that sort of thing. So every time you've deployed a mini game, that is a mechanic from another thing played with D&D numbers.
Right.
So if you can do that, if you're okay with putting in mini games, the wrestling game at the bar or the drinking game, or magical challenges that at the Wizard's Tower, you're already putting in other mechanics from other systems into your D&D.
Yeah.
Which means that if they were successful, your players are okay with that.
Right.
Nowhere in the rules for D&D does it say, how do I settle an arm wrestling competition at the bar? Nowhere.
Right. Anytime you do anything at all that the book does not do. So I had an argument with a friend of mine about this not that long ago. For those of you who might not be familiar with the term, I think we said it earlier, raw means read as written. As opposed to, sometimes opposed to, sometimes in conjunction with, as differentiated from, there we go. RIA or RI, which sounds silly, read as intended, which if both of those exist, that means read as written means you do not interpret, period. You read it the way it is, that's it. Because if you make any interpretation that's read as interpreted or read as intended, you are attempting to psychologically assess what the creator, in this case WotC, meant by what that block of text says. That is not as written, that's you attempting to perceive intention, which means if you're playing raw, the second you make a judgment call, because judgment is intuition. So the second you make a judgment call, you don't just let the book tell you what to do, and you just don't do things the book doesn't cover explicitly. You are changing away from raw to adapt the setting to fit what makes sense at this moment, otherwise known as a judgment call. Congratulations, you are now playing D&D, like as the book suggests, because it says right in the front, some version of do what you like. My friend Valis gets all bent out of shape when the rule 0 isn't written as do what the group agrees on, instead of do what you, as the GM or whatever term you like, want. And I agree with him. It should be a group assessment. I just don't think it should be written down like that. Then again, I believe in a world where everybody accommodates everybody else a little bit. So
not everyone is like you and me. No,
yeah, it's true. That's very true. And there are a bunch of GMs who are going to be like, no, this line says I can do what I want. Excuse me. I'd like it to be an us thing.
Right. Because in the end of it is, if you do what you want, but no one else wants that, they're not going to play with you.
Right. No, you're kind of being a jerk. It's a group activity, right?
And the one piece of advice that I want to close on, because we're getting a little bit extended.
Long in the tooth.
If anyone is still watching this, thank you for starters, but don't be afraid to iterate. So I'm going to show you how much I am unafraid to iterate. Is that this little thing that I use currently with all the rules that I normally have to reference, and my little clock thing, which by the way, I didn't make this clock image. I got that from the same download place. These are the things that I use now. You're a friend of Z Bishaw, if I'm not mistaken.
Say that one more time.
You have a friend that actually makes animations for YouTube for about D&D.
Oh, I know Z and I are friends, but we talk. Yeah.
Well, this is ripped off exactly from one of his videos. I did not make this. This is the exact table I just screenshot.
That does look like his font. It sure does. Okay.
Use it the thing. don't be afraid to now I'm not going to sell this, which is why I'm
right.
so, but this is the one I currently use because these are the rules that I have had the most interaction with. And this is my current tool that I use for, and I can actually show you if you will allow me to share my
It
screen
should
with
still
you
be
for a
set
little
to
bit.
do that.
I will show you exactly what these look like. Dun, dun. Where are we? Screen 2. Yep, there we go. So you should be seeing on screen, this is the little table that I made for myself for tracking hit points. But on the same file, I also put in, so I can print it as many times as I need, my combat tracker. So this will give me the initiative, and it's just by ranges because I don't have this many people fighting. If they've already, this is a thing that I didn't know I needed to track, if they've already used their reaction or not. Because sometimes people want to take more than one reaction around, and that you can't do that. On the right-hand side, how many rounds have gone by? On the right-hand side as well, what does concentration mean? Like, well, he loses concentration in these cases. What does cover mean? All the conditions, and the bottom, what can be done in every round. Why? Because I don't want to have to look this up every round, and this comes up every now and then. But that is the current one. If you want to take a look at the front page that I'm showing here, that is the current thing that I use in print. These are the things that I use. I track time. I track skill challenges because that's a 4th edition thing that I actually use, even though it's not 5th edition. I put that in. The social encounter difficulty level, monster research. That table is exactly the same as it appears in Tasha's.
It's been a while since I did any 4th edition skill challenges, but remind me, a skill challenge is you have to essentially pass a skill check multiple times in succession.
Not quite. It is, well, not quite. So a skill challenge is meant for something that you cannot put on a grid, but has some narrative significance, that it's not just one roll. So for example, a classic skill challenge is, I want to persuade the Senate to vote my way. Well, what can I persuade them with? Well, I have high persuasion. Okay, I need to have this many successes. So if it's an easy challenge, just 3. If it's a medium challenge, 6. If it's a hard challenge, 9. Before I fail 10 times. And the difficulty is set depending on the challenge. So for example, the Senate is against me. Well, the difficulty might be 15 then. Okay, I need to succeed this many times. Maybe they're against me, but it's not a long debate, just 3 times. I need to succeed 3 times before I fail 3 times.
Okay.
And so what can I use?
What this looks like to me is death saves from 5e. Essentially, that mechanic used for a different function.
Similar. Now, the difference here is that the skill challenge one is meant to be done by the whole group, which means that but it's also only meant to use the skills you're proficient in. So you can't, if you're not proficient in nature, you can't use nature for the skill challenge, but maybe someone
your druid can, right?
Your druid can. Now, in the case of convincing the Senate, how would you use nature, your ability with nature, to convince the Senate? If you can come up with a plausible way to do that, I'll allow it, sure. But if you roll lower than a 15, that's a failure anyway. If you fail 3 times before you succeed the amount of times that you need to succeed, the skill challenge fails. And that is something that could take time. So you're not gonna role play a full 2 hours of discussion with the Senate. You're gonna do a skill challenge, and that represents 2 hours. Which,
I mean,
by the way,
you might if your players go nuts for that kind of thing.
Which we did. Well, at our table, we discussed with the god of law, which was Primus, I believe.
Yeah.
We actually had a guest come in to be that person, so it wasn't something at the table. It was a fun time. But when you
that was wicked cool. I would have bet money that when I said, because I went out of my way to try and make that frustrating when you're like, oh, you want to talk to Primus? Okay, well, we're not really doing that. So you're gonna have to fill out this form that may take 6 to 8 months for it to get near his secretary's desk. And once the secretary sees it, do we get the appointment? No. Can we speak? Not necessarily. Can we? First, it'll have to be filed. That'll take 6 to 8 months. Then the other, like I tried to make that as bureaucracy adjacent as possible. And for some reason, you all went for it anyway. And I was like, well, crap. No, I guess I need to. I originally planned on that not being a thing. Like there was going to be no Are you kidding? So full disclosure, because Grant already knows this now. Um, when you were under attack by that great golem thingy, and Grant said, "Oh my God, is it Primus?" It was not. It was just a golem creature because it's a plane made of sand and soot. And I thought that enough of that sand and soot might have compressed into being a giant golem being was fun. That was it. Like, so I said, of course, I said, yeah, absolutely. While I looked up who Primus was on Google. Like, I absolutely lied. Like,
Which, by the way, was fantastic. We ran with it. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this is not the first iteration of this thing. The first iteration looked like this because I thought it was super important to keep track of what time of day it was and what happened on this day in a calendar on this side, and only use social encounter DCs and skill challenges. So I have this printed out somewhere.
What's with the sigil in the middle of the wheel?
Oh, that is my personal logo. So it's a T, an X, and an M. Because for the longest time, I went by a moniker. TX is the abbreviation for Texas, which is where I was born, and M for magician. So it's Texas Magician, TXM.
I see.
I just like that.
I see.
But here's the thing. It turns out that I needed more than that. So I made a new version of it. So even the tools you use, you iterate on them just like you iterate on the mechanics you use. Don't be afraid of that. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen with you for a little bit so I can show you things in real life. So I actually, this is the original tool that I made for myself because I thought that all I needed to track was enemy hit points. And I'm like, well, I don't know how many enemies I'm going to have, oh yeah. So which, by the way, I make these for myself, which means I don't sell these, which is why I have images that don't belong to me.
Right.
But no one, but I thought that it was super important. I thought it was super important it says, well, what condition are they under? How many hit points do they have? What their name? What their armor class is? And as the more I use it, like, I don't need all of that information there. So like, let's take that out. So I made a different version, which also has funny images on the other side. And I'm like, okay, what I do need is to track the rounds and the initiative order and space for notes. And you'll notice that here it has for up to 8 minutes of in-game combat. That's 80 rounds. I thought that would be important.
No fight's gonna take that long.
Well, it turns out you're right. And so on my next iteration, I'm like, well, if I'm already going to have this out, I might as well have something useful on the outside and not just a funny image, which is the first time I put the social encounter difficulties in the skill challenge, so I can just write on that. And on the back, the wheels take time. And then on the inside, now it's not 8 rounds. Now, you know what? It can't go more than 4 rounds. Let's be serious. It's never going to go that far. And my initiative table. Well, it turns out it never goes more than 2 rounds. So now I have more use. So even on the tools that you use, don't be afraid to iterate and make adaptations that work for your table and that work for you. If the system didn't account for it, adapt something else, make it work. And if it doesn't work, do it again. Dungeons and Dragons and any role-playing game is a living game, much like a language. It is not set in stone, which means that you are developing the tools to have fun with your friends or with your clients. It's fine. And those tools change just like language changes, just like people change. It turns out you didn't need that. You need this. All right, make that version. Well, we didn't like that mechanic. Okay, what did we not like? We don't like how swingy it is. Okay, so less swingy. So more fail states. Perfect. Well, now we don't like what die it uses because it's less dramatic. Okay, so same fail states, but more coin tossy. Okay, instead of a die, flip a coin. Iterate until you find what you need. And guess what? It's a living game, which means what you liked today, 2 years down the road, you might be sick of. Change it again.
Right. Like, so D&D, I feel like people put a lot of stock in D&D in its current, like, raw, printed by WotC form. Or really any other tabletop. Capernaum is a single book release. Five Torches Deep is not technically a single book release in that the book is like $20, but there's like 3 more books that are all, I think, $9 a piece. And they're all supplemental. Like this one's full of magic items. This one's going to focus on dueling. This one's going to focus on stealth, whatever. But there's not a lot of material. And a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on what's official. Officially, right? Like WotC is a company. They want you to spend money on their books. Then they want everybody to spend money on their books because the more books get sold, the more money they get. So they build their system on purpose to appeal to the most people, which means they did not build it for you. They didn't build it for you in your group. They probably don't know you. They know Matt Mercer well, and they did not make that book for him. Quite the contrary, actually, he has his own books, right? Like, they did not make that book for him. They didn't make it for Matt Colville. They didn't make it for any of the GMs you know from like Critical Role or TV. Like Satine Phoenix is amazing, and they did not make the book for her. They didn't make it for them. They didn't make it for you. So feel free to adjust it, because Dave Arneson didn't sit down with his friends one day and say, we're going to make a role-playing game. They were already playing something. And then the Fog of War, they were like, okay, we want to change that. Hey, can we do fantasy instead? Well, what were you thinking? You know, like a big ass castle. Yeah, sure. One day the planes go and fly through like the mists of Avalon, Castle Blackmore. Right. And then they quest the castle for a while. And they're like, one day they're like, hey Dave, what's outside the castle? Well, crap, I hadn't thought of that. What's outside the castle? There's a forest and a lake and shit. And eventually the D&D we have now didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen over a year. It happened over D&D originally came out for you to buy in 1974. But Dave and his friends were working on that before Gary Gygax was even introduced to the equation for something like a decade prior to that, which means that D&D in its current form took forever to get to. Change your game all the time. Constantly be adjusting it for you and your group. If you want, like the D&D that was published in 1974 is the game that Dave and his friends played, which is how come it didn't appeal to everyone. And if you go find yourselves a copy of the original edition, which is going to cost you a lot of money, maybe your grandfather has one, right? But it is difficult to read because Dave wrote it and he didn't choose to remember. He didn't recall, right? That the people who would read it did not have all of the information that he had in his brain. He forgot. He didn't write it from the viewpoint of the uninformed noob. He wrote it from his point of view, which is how come it's kind of a pain in the ass to read. You don't so much read it as decipher it, whereas 5th edition doesn't do that. This is how come Skyrim is super popular and Morrowind tends not to be. I don't like Skyrim. It's boring. It's shallow. There's not a lot of depth there. I'm not a fan. It takes out a lot of the stuff that earlier editions had. It does include multi-attack. It does include dual wielding, which is cool. And you can smith, and that's cool. But for me, that's it. That's where all the benefits of Skyrim drop. You can't craft your own spells, for example. The last 4 games let you do that. And that was some of the most boss stuff in those games. But it's also squirrely to play with. Not everybody is going to want to care. Not everybody is going to want to put in the work. Morrowind does not care to make sense. It says, here is how I am. Deal with it. Skyrim accommodates you up front. It says, here's the skill system. It's super easy to understand. And for what it's worth, perk points are fun. But I don't think that's enough for me to enjoy Skyrim on its own. I had to put a couple hundred mods into Skyrim to like it. And I still only like it. I don't love it. I love Morrowind the way it was. I continue to play it today. I just upscaled the graphics and took out that obnoxious random roll thing. Anyway, WotC builds their systems just like any good company does. Modifius, White Wolf, whatever. They build their system to appeal to the mass audience. You're not the mass audience. You're an individual with individual opinions. Change your game. Yeah. You should. You should adapt it so it's the thing you want. If the thing you want happens to be 5e as presented, cool. But if it's not, don't let the word official scare you away from making an adjustment.
I make my own unofficial stuff all the time, and I play mostly rules as written, and still I make my unofficial stuff.
Yeah. In that Friday table where they went at the idea of giving up spell slots after they tried it, and really they didn't hiss at that. They hissed at the fuck up table. What are we? Let's see. I just had a player. He's a fighter, I think. Gain access to a magic spell. Like he can cast that particular spell now. The character builder doesn't know how to deal with that. He's
Nope.
like, it's where do I put that in? I'm going to write it in your notes section. He went,
Yeah.
but how do I put it in? You write it in your notes section. Here, let me help you with that, because 5e is not prepared for that. That said, he loves the fact that he can get the drop on NPCs because we assume the world of, I try and match this the world to the setting, the structure we're currently using. In 5e, it's a class-based system. Fighters do this, and mages do this, and clerics do this. And those beings exist in the world outside of just your players. My players run into other adventuring parties all the time. They're NPCs, but they're also clearly wizards and fighters and clerics and whatever. So this creates a certain degree of social norm within the world. So when he, as a fighter, right, encounters another fighter who looks at him, sizes them both up like a thug tends to do, and goes, "I'm bigger than you. I'm going to win." Ha, and marches towards him, right? And my player goes, "Fireball." That fighter shits his pants because he didn't see that coming, you know? So the player's having a lot of fun with that. And the system had to get out of the way. If your vision proved too large for the system to contain, break it. Make space for your vision.
Absolutely, absolutely agreed. And the system will try, because they want to sell product, to give you those options, but it might not exactly be the finesse that you want for it. So screw it, make your own options. It's absolutely fine. Or take them from the system that you like that did that option well, wholesale it right in. And again, I can insist, a mini game is a wholesale adaptation from something else into this world that will never resemble anything in any book, and you're still okay with it. Do the same for the piece of combat that you want to resolve that way. It's exactly the same.
Right.
Well, with that being said, I want to thank everyone who made it all the way this far. It's been a long winding road, but I do believe that there's a couple of useful pieces in there. Most of them are that don't be afraid to try it out. Worst case scenario is you've got the math wrong and it doesn't work the way you wanted to. Move it around. You do not have to be a statistics expert. You do have to be willing to get it wrong to get it right eventually. And that is true for adapting things to 5e as it is in life. Sometimes you'll screw up, try it again, make it better next time. Well, that is my final comment for that. Thank you for your time. Jay, anything you want to say before we go? I do believe that there's a
Franco's the friggin' best. I don't know.
Thank you, and we'll continue to do this. Send in your questions of anything you want us to touch on, and we'll do our best to go as in-depth and useful as necessary. Until next time, Franco over here and Jay on that side. See you soon.